Good morning. We have a few more colleagues streaming in. I'm so happy that we were able to fit this amazing Bold Thinker series in before the Pope showed up tomorrow. I'm Kathleen Flanagan, the President and CEO of Apt Associates, and I'd love to welcome you here today to our next in the series of Bold Thinker series here at the museum. Is housing stability essential for family well-being? We have an amazing agenda for you all this morning. We bring together thought leaders like yourselves on a regular basis over the course of the year to discuss pressing issues in the area of health, the environment, housing, employment. And today, as I glance around the room, I see some amazing thought leaders in the audience here today representing, of course, Housing and Urban Development, Department of Labor, HHS, foundations, service providers, nonprofits, universities. That's who we need to have in the room when we discuss important topics like the one today. So thank you for taking the time to be here. For the last 50 years, producing and disseminating rigorous research results has been a priority for all of us at Apt Associates. And I know a number of you in the room as well. So today we're pleased to share the evidence from the Family Option Study. Most importantly, to discuss what this evidence might mean for future policy. We have the right people in the room, as I said. The study was the first large-scale experiment ever conducted to test the effectiveness of homeless interventions for families. So we're very pleased that our colleagues at the Housing and Urban Development Agency took that bold step to fund this study. And our team of researchers at Apt Associates and Vanderbilt University were so pleased to have been able to work closely with HUD to gather the evidence about which types of housing and service interventions work best for homeless families. And today we're going to have the opportunity to share that with you and discuss next steps, forward-looking thoughts, the next innovations in helping this at-risk population. We have an engaging agenda for you this morning. We're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to have Steve Bell, our Vice President and Senior Fellow, come up to the stage first and give you the background of the study, talk to you a little bit about the results. We're then going to move on and have Jeff Lubell, our Director of Housing and Community Initiatives, talk about the policy framework. And then we're going to move into two very engaging panels. The first, from the front lines of research, How Housing Matters to Children and Families, will be moderated by Ron Haskins. Ron is the co-director of the Brookings Center on Children and Families and Budgeting for National Priorities Project. And then the next panel, From Evidence to Policy, Implications for Housing and Beyond, will be moderated by my colleague, Jill Kaduri, Senior Fellow, Principal Associate, and expert on this topic at Apt Associates. We, of course, have reserved time for questions and answers because we want to make sure we're engaging all of you in the room on this important topic. So we'll make sure that we have time to hear your questions and have some more debate and discussion. For those of you adept at tweeting, I'm a dinosaur, so we are following this at #FamilyOptions. So if you'd like to tweet, feel free. Again, thanks for joining us this morning. We have a few hours of important and engaging discussion, I'm sure. So let's get the conversation started, and I'd like to invite Steve Bell to the podium.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Steve Bell, Principal Investigator for this Family Option Study at Apt Associates. Together with Beth Shen at Vanderbilt University and many researchers in these two organizations, I have helped to put together the policy information we're looking at here today. I consider family options the most important and challenging impact evaluation of social assistance that I've ever been a part of over several decades of my career. The study is important not only because the findings are striking and impactful, but because homelessness is a terrible problem in America. The latest annual homeless assessment report tells us that families encompassing 500,000 people enter homeless shelters each year, and many more spend nights on the street without a place to sleep. So a study that provides the first rigorous evidence of how we can combat this problem effectively is monumental. It would not have been possible without steadfast support from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development over many years, and the expert guidance of Ann Fletcher and colleagues at the Office of Policy Development and Research. What is the Family Option Study? Here we go. Maybe. The green button. There we go. This is not, by the way, this is a major checkpoint with hugely important research knowledge, but it's not the end of the Family Option Study. These are findings over 20 months of follow-up from the point families were in shelters. Our study will go another round of data collection, and down the road, a year or plus, we'll be able to tell you more about really long-run consequences of different assistance strategies. So here, let's look at the 20-month impact findings from Family Options. The goal of this study is to assess how to help improve housing stability and social and economic well-being of families in homeless shelters. We look at 3 programmatic interventions to that effect. Permanent housing subsidy, which we abbreviate as SUB, community-based rapid rehousing, CBRR, and project-based transitional housing, PBTH. Many of you are quite familiar with these interventions. I'll say a bit more about them to ground all of us here in a moment. But in each case, the research approach is to contrast results for families that are given priority access to one of these against outcomes under usual care, which is to say, leaving the families in the shelter without accelerated access to a particular type of intervention. The policy questions we consider, the policy question, how can homelessness be improved? I covered that. We covered the nation to get these data. 12 communities with all the diversity you could expect. Encompassed in our findings are the efforts of almost 150 local agencies that deliver the interventions under study in these parts of America. And they're hugely important partners in making this work possible. Here's the design of the research. A family that's been in a shelter at least 7 days, family with a child under 15, other children as well, is identified, and if consenting to help with the learning agenda, was randomly assigned into one of 4 sets. One random group was given direct access to a permanent housing subsidy. Another one was slotted towards rapid rehousing assistance. A third group was invited to come to a project-based transitional housing program. And a fourth and final statistically equivalent subset did not get any of these benefits. Those families could access whatever is in the community by whatever means they initiated. But we've got large groups of individuals, I didn't mention, but we randomly allocated about 2,300 families across these 4 cells. Includes roughly 5,400 people. With that big a sample, splitting purely by chance, there's no reason subsequent results would systematically differ here between the groups, except because the interventions are having an effect. And that's why this is such definitive information about what's working and what's not. Permanent housing subsidies are mostly housing vouchers. They are basically financial support to the family to make decent housing affordable. No added services as a direct part of the intervention. Rapid rehousing is temporary rent support with some housing-focused service components. Transitional housing places families in agency-controlled buildings where intensive, broad services are delivered to address family problems other than just housing affordability. For our sample, subsidy can be indefinite, and the families that made use of the subsidy are generally still benefiting from that assistance at the end of our current 20-month follow-up. On average, the rapid rehousing group was in the program 7 months, and the transitional housing group 12 months. Our research looked at 73 different outcomes for the families in 5 domains of well-being: their housing stability, preservation of families, intact families, adult and child well-being, and economic self-sufficiency. As I take you through these areas, I'll spend a little more time on the first, the housing stability effects, since that's the foundation, the leverage point for any gains these interventions produce in the other domains. The highlights on housing stability: the degree of improvement, and bear in mind this is medium run, 1 to 2 years out. The effects in putting families in a stable housing environment was varied. Permanent subsidies resulted in large improvements that we'll look at in just a moment compared to usual care. Transitional housing made more limited contributions to stability. Rapid rehousing doesn't have an effect once a year or more has gone by. It does not have an effect on housing stability. As measured by 3 central indicators, and these are the results for the permanent subsidy compared to usual care. There are 3 indicators here, across left to right. The gray bars are shares of families from usual care that ended up with a problem in being securely housed. We're looking for effects that reduce the gray bars down to the red bar. The red bars are the same measures for equivalent families who were routed to priority access with a permanent subsidy. So we see on the left any homelessness nights in the 6 months at the end of our 20-month follow-up that befell a quarter of families not given directed assistance. This was reduced by more than half if a voucher for permanent subsidy was provided. Again, about a 50% reduction in the second indicator to the middle of the chart, whether a shelter stay occurred. Again, all these families began in shelter, but transitioned out in almost all cases. But many returned, over a quarter under usual care, only half that number when the subsidy voucher was made available, the permanent subsidy. And finally, the reduction in the third housing problem, doubling up with another family in the most recent 6 months was reduced by more than half by a permanent subsidy. So you make housing more affordable by covering much of its cost. The housing is there for more families and steadily in place. That's step one. That's an essential, right? And we see some of that when we look to project-based transitional housing, where these are the same measures in the three sets of bars. We're looking for reductions, modest reductions then in homelessness and in shelter stays. No effect from transitional housing once we get out into the second follow-up year. No effect on the rate at which families doubled up to have a place to sleep. Lastly, within the housing stability realm, this picture speaks for itself. We're not seeing that community-based rapid rehousing is a difference maker for keeping families in their own living space on a steady basis in this follow-up window. No effects, no statistically significant effects on any of the three indicators. So the action looks like is coming in from a permanent subsidy to a lesser degree for transitional housing, well, though those other interventions have some elements that aren't just going to act through the housing stability channel. So let's look for where this goes. What else is changed for families when the housing needs are addressed, or at least an intervention attempts to address housing needs? Family preservation looks at whether children remain with their parents, the children that were there at enrollment in the shelter, and whether where married or partner couples were present at the outset, whether those relationships are preserved. Here we see that subsidy cuts separation of children from parents by half, as well as foster care placements by half. Something about knowing you can meet the rent, staying in a stable housing setting is preserving families in some instances where that would not have happened otherwise. Not true of rapid rehousing or transitional housing. No measurable effects on family preservation for those interventions. And when we looked at the couple side, none of the programs mattered to sustaining couples relationships over 20 months. Adult well-being. We're getting more echoes, we're getting more ripples, I should say, of the financial help with a stable living situation. Here, all of the action comes from the permanent subsidy intervention. It lowers self-reported dependence on alcohol and drugs by about 1/3, reduces reported intimate partner violence by nearly half, and also reduces psychological distress. We measured whether there were other health effects and did not find a carryover there. But across a broad range, adult life quality and risk factors are reduced by a permanent housing subsidy. No benefits to these measures emerge from transitional housing or rapid rehousing. Child well-being, fourth domain out of our 5. subsidy is again a benefit to the children, to their education. It reduces number of schools attended, which has been shown to enhance child learning, to be in a stable school setting. And it reduced absences from school, obviously beneficial. Rapid rehousing also had that second effect. Transitional housing, no gains in the schooling domain. And when we looked at other child outcomes, health and behavior problems, none of the interventions show an effect. Finally, economic self-sufficiency. Here, the permanent subsidy to help pay housing costs had a detrimental effect. It reduced the share work of adults working for pay at the 20-month interview, reduced it from that share from 30 to 24%. This isn't a surprise. With rent assistance, the need for other income sources is not as acute. The imperative to work and earn income is somewhat lessened. Moreover, there's a direct disincentive to work because the amount your housing voucher pays on your rent goes down as your earnings go up. So past research has shown the same thing, that, and not just for housing-focused assistance, but any kind of income support is going to dampen labor for income support tied to need is going to, as measured by other income, any income support tied to need is going to dampen labor force engagement to some extent, and we see it here. No detrimental effects on employment from the other two interventions, but that, they weren't causing changes by and large, so they didn't have this one negative repercussion. On the plus side, families' food security was increased by the subsidies and by rapid rehab, both permanent subsidies and temporary subsidies under community-based rapid rehousing. And quite importantly, and somewhat of a puzzle at this point, but it's very clear in the data, that slotting a family through rapid rehousing for an average of 7 months, down the line in the most recent year, 12 months, is raising families' total income by a considerable share, and it comes to $1,100, which underlines still how extremely limited incomes are in this population at follow-up. With the added 1,100, we still are looking at only about 10,000 in annual earnings. Now, we're paying to help families in this way. We're paying for the subsidies and the services. And they cost quite a varied amount of money. When we go to the data from the agencies delivering the assistance in these 12 communities, and we break it down to how much is spent in a month on an average family when using their permanent subsidy voucher, when enrolled in rapid rehousing, etc. To the left, we see that the monthly family cost of those two interventions is relatively low, around $1,000. Then moving to the right, transitional housing, very service-rich, facility-based, costs 2 to 3 times as much to deliver in over a course of a month. An emergency shelter is really expensive, almost twice again as costly, nearing $5,000 a month. This adds up with time. And we added it up. We took each of the samples, we looked at which of these interventions families took part in, for how long, In and out, and a lot of back end to shelters. And in 20 months, how much did it take in resources to deliver the impact results we've already seen? The families given access to a permanent subsidy, on average, all housing program assistance, not just their voucher, but the emergency shelter at the beginning, maybe later if there was a return, other things, everything folded in, accumulated over 20 months. It's about $31,000 invested by society. Strikingly, that's hardly any more than if you don't try any active assistance. You leave the family in the shelter initially to fend for itself. Usual care, on average, drew down essentially the same level of resources. Much more of it was shelter care, but other things as well. These families do find their way to transitional housing. Some get a subsidy voucher on their own. But you break even on funding when you go the permanent subsidy route. You break even on funding when you go the transitional housing route, again, around $31,000. There may be a difference emerge down the line. Stay tuned. As I've said, the transitional housing has all happened already in the first 20 months. The permanent subsidies will continue and will add costs. So the comparative costs, we would think, will shift depending on how much, how sustained the use of the vouchers is and how much cycling through other forms of assistance continues in the contrasting groups. Rapid rehousing in these 20 months is slightly less costly across all spending than the other two, active interventions or usual care. So, to sum up, providing long-term financial assistance delivers benefits to families in all the domains considered, without a special focus on social services. Enhance resources, stabilize home, other good things follow. That is big time news and big time happy for these families. It's disappointing that the rapid solution to homelessness is not yielding better results, though it saves some money. And the one strategy that was largely about addressing things beyond housing finance, project-based transitional housing, is doing a little bit for housing stability, but nothing else to improve results in this 20-month window. So I conclude with the surprises about permanent subsidies. Adding to what I've said already, a family with high needs, extremely high needs, and with assistance getting enrolled into voucher programs, we see very high take-up. So if policy makes these things available to families in shelter, the subsidy will be used. That's not been true of other groups studied, not nearly to the same extent. So it's important that you can get the financing in place, not just deem eligible, but families have to get through the hoops to use it. These families use it. The benefits radiate, and the costs are not higher than stepping aside without subsidy support, because we pay somewhere else. Those are our findings for this conversation. I'd now like to welcome my colleague Jeff Lubell to set those in context for the rest of our morning.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning. I'm going to try that again. Good morning. Excellent. This is it's really great to see so many of my colleagues from the housing world, as well as individuals working in other policy domains. I'm gonna provide a bridge this morning between the findings of the Family Option Study and the topic of today's conversation, which is how housing really makes a difference for adult and child well-being. This will also test my ability to read very small print across the way, so I apologize in advance if I miss any of the information here. I have three goals of my presentation this morning. The first is to talk about why are we having this conversation? Why does it matter how housing makes a difference for things other than housing? Why isn't it enough that it just produces housing outcomes? Secondly, I want to introduce a conceptual framework that will help provide a common vocabulary as we think about the relationship between housing and other social policy outcomes. And in the process, I want to review some of the promising hypotheses about why we think housing may make a difference for adult and child well-being, citing a number of other important studies. So why do we care? I think the argument could be posed this way. Housing is a basic need, shelter is a basic need. Isn't it enough that we're meeting this basic need? Why do we have to show and think about benefits radiating outside of housing in order to justify spending money on housing? And I think there are three main answers that are cited. I just want to walk through them really, really quickly. The first is to inform the debate on the right funding level for permanent housing, for government housing programs. As I think most of you know, housing is not an entitlement in this country. Depending on how you count, only about 1/3 to 1/4 of households that are in need of housing assistance get it. So there is a debate that goes on every year, it's going on right now, about what's the right funding level for housing programs. And the argument, I think, is that to the extent that one can show that housing programs have an effect not just on shelter and housing domains, but also on other things that people care about, on the health of children and of parents, on educational outcomes, on labor outcomes, that there is therefore a greater support for housing expenditures. So that's one argument that's often made. And typically that's framed as broadening the constituency for affordable housing, right? Getting a broader group of people to care about housing programs. And I would add there's also a debate about how much money should be spent on each individual program. The study, the Family Option Study, one of the things that makes it unique, it's really one of the first studies to try to contrast the outcomes from several different policy interventions aimed at a similar problem in a similar population. So we actually have some data that can help inform a conversation about what's the right allocation of funding between different programs. So while that's probably the most common issue, I think it's equally important, if not more important, to ask the question, what does this teach us about how to design housing programs? In other words, it's not just a funding question, it's a policy question. Can we learn things that will make housing programs more effective so that with the same amount of money, we're actually having bigger and broader and more impactful outcomes on the things that really matter, which are the well-being of children and families. And related to that is this very important idea that, this is just me personally, I do think we need to do a better job thinking across policy domains and across policy silos. We tend to fund programs. We have housing programs, we have health programs, we have labor programs, we have employment programs, right? We've got all these different silos. But you know, if you've ever looked at a person, there's no place on our body, right, where we have these different silos. And you know, people are complex, holistic organisms, and communities are also complex and holistic. And we really need to be thinking not just about what's the right housing intervention, but what's the right package of supports across multiple domains to really have a difference in the kind of outcomes that we really care about. And this kind of research can really help us by identifying that connection to help us design more effective interventions across these policy domains. All right, I don't want to scare you too much with the idea of a conceptual framework. It's not, this part at least is not that complicated. On the left, you have the attributes of housing that may make a difference. On the right, you have the kinds of impacts outside of the housing world that we care about. There's some stuff that will happen in the middle to make it a little more complicated. That's why there's that middle thing there. But you know, housing is not a single thing. And this is very important, I think, for the conceptual framework. Housing is what we call sometimes a suitcase variable. It has lots of different attributes, and you can manipulate individually those different attributes. It has a cost, right? It is in a particular location. It can be of a particular quality and size. Your housing situation may be more or less stable in the sense that you have more or less control over whether and under what circumstances you move. And you can be in different kinds of tenures, right? You can be renting or owning. And all of these things, individually or in combination, can have an effect on things on the right. So for example, there's an important hypothesis about the affordability of housing as it relates to physical health. The argument is basically this, that if households are spending so much of their income on housing, too much of their income on housing, they have relatively little funding left over to spend on nutritious food. And as a result, their children may have less nutritious food and therefore poorer physical health. And there's, I would say, a modest amount of preliminary evidence on that. There's also a relationship that is posited between housing affordability and mental health. Think about someone who is going through an eviction or someone who is going through a foreclosure proceeding and the kind of stress that engenders. It's not too hard to imagine, and there's some preliminary evidence to suggest that those kinds of stressful effects may matter for adult mental health, and as a result, that may affect their ability to be good parents, right, and have an effect on their children as well. There's also a cluster of hypotheses around education that are important. One is a relationship between location and education. Many of us are very well familiar with this because it affects our own housing search, right? We look to move to areas that have good school systems. That's basically, in a nutshell, the relationship between location and education. But there's another important hypothesis here that's particularly important for affordable housing programs, which is this concept of the relationship between the stability of your housing situation and educational outcomes. And basically, the argument is that the more schools you're moving to, the less likely the child is to get a consistent educational program, and therefore less likely they are to do well in school. Now, it's important to remember that housing stability and school stability are not the same thing, and there is sometimes a direct connection and sometimes a more attenuated connection. Often, this is where the interaction with other policy matters. Often in communities that have school choice, right? You can choose what school you send your child to. It's not entirely location-based. So, but anyway, that's an important hypothesis that we probably ought to pay attention to. Just one final hypothesis here, which is the relationship, potential relationship between housing quality and size and physical and mental health. We know from the research on lead paint, for example, that the housing conditions can make a big difference directly on child well-being and child health. If you ingest paint chips, right, you're going to have very serious issues that will affect your physical health, your mental functioning. There's also some interesting hypotheses, and maybe Sandy will talk about these. She's working on a study that will talk about these between the quality and size of housing and mental health. You know, think about a very dark, cramped housing situation and what effect that may have on the mental health of the adult, and therefore on their ability to parent, right? And this is important, again, that pathways parent in terms of the effect on children. Now, when we introduce government housing assistance, we are adding a series of dimensions to housing that matter. Those are, for example, duration. Steve talked about the different durations of various housing programs, and that's an important aspect that we need to think about. You have services. Housing may or may not come with different bundles of services that may address different things. And then there's a host of administrative requirements that come with housing subsidies that are not trivial, right? You have to show up every year for your annual recertification. That involves a certain process that you may or may not want to go through. There's the connection between income and rent that Steve talked about too. Okay, I wish it were that simple. I do want to introduce just a little bit of complexity here. I think it's really important because it suggests why this is so hard to get right and why it takes a lot of very careful work to both study this and also research this. So the first is the context. Very simply, if you're a homeless family, you may react differently from other kinds of families, right? That's a personal context that matters. And varying that context can help us understand, for example, which group can really benefit the most from different forms of housing assistance. There's also a community context, right? There are issues of racial and ethnic segregation that, for example, may affect the relationship of location to education. It may reflect the consequences of being in particular areas rather than other areas. And there are many other contexts, right? You can have different amounts of variation in school quality, right, in different communities. All of these things are going to kind of attenuate and intermediate between the dimensions of housing and the effects on adults and children. A second issue is this issue of individual variation. Very important. Not everybody is necessarily going to respond the same way in the same situation. We tend to think they will, right? We have all these hypotheses, but it turns out we know, for example, that some children are more resilient than others. Resilience matters a lot, and so a resilient child is going to be, I think, less likely to respond to certain kinds of stimuli than others, and better able to weather that, right? So one thing you need to do is think about, can you tailor the assistance to people who need it the most? But also, to the extent that there's random individual variation, you're going to need large sample sizes, right, in order to capture that. Trade-offs. So the basic concept here is that families often trade off between different aspects of housing in ways that we don't fully understand. So just one illustration. If you have a set amount of money, you often have to make a decision about where you're going to live. Are you going to rent a larger unit in perhaps less good quality in a really good neighborhood that you want to live in? Or do you pick a unit that has granite countertops, is a wonderful unit, but it's maybe in a marginal neighborhood, right? And that's a choice that a lot of people make, and it's a choice that ends up being, I think, important for the housing voucher program in particular, in ways I'll talk about in just a second. And the final issue is this interaction. So the housing dimensions are not independent of one another, but sometimes there are interactions between one and the next. And this one in particular, the relationship of cost and stability, is really important because it essentially is the fundamental underlying assumption about housing assistance we make, which is that giving people the ability to better afford their housing is going to make them more stable, right? And you can measure stability in different ways. Typically, people focus on how many times people move. That's not my preferred measure. It's the easiest thing to measure. I would rather have a more subjective measure that focuses on giving people the ability to control whether and under what circumstances they move, because some moves can be good for children, some can be bad, right? It depends on why you're moving, how often you're moving, under what circumstances you move. Okay, so what I want to do next is just very quickly put the permanent housing subsidy into the context of this framework. I'm then going to talk about just two other studies very quickly and then turn to our first panel. So permanent housing subsidy is as Steve mentioned, was the housing subsidy that seemed to have the biggest effects on other domains. We are directly there influencing three things. One is the cost of the housing. We're making it more affordable, right? Because families pay approximately 30% of their adjusted income for housing costs. We're also, there are minimum quality standards that apply, so we are hopefully improving housing quality. And there are sizes that attach to the vouchers. You get a specific sort of size voucher depending on the standards of the housing authority. And then, of course, there are all these administrative requirements that we talked about that may have independent effects. Now, some interactions, again, there's that effect, the interaction between cost and stability, right? The assumption is that by helping people afford their housing, they're more stable. But there are also some trade-offs. And one that applies in the family option study that you don't see applying in other cases, which is why it's not in my framework, is this idea of immediacy, right? You're in a shelter. You get priority access to a voucher. Do you spend 6 months trying to figure out where you want to live and go investigate, a dozen places and check out the schools? Or do you pick the first available unit because you want to get out of that shelter because you know that your family needs, a place to live? I would suggest that is an issue that families are really confronting and may have had an impact, for example, on the locational outcomes for families, though we haven't yet studied that. But then there's this issue between quality and location that every voucher holder faces, and I think it's important that you really have to make a decision when you have a housing voucher. Are you going to pick the unit with granite countertops that's larger, but maybe in a neighborhood that perhaps is not as good a neighborhood for you and for your children? Or are you going to, again, pick a unit that's a little more cramped, a little more basic, but is in an area with good school districts? So an important question, one we still don't fully understand the answer, but we do know enough from some qualitative research that that's something that voucher holders are wrestling with. I'm not going to repeat the impacts, but just to list them here. Positive effects on housing stability. I've included there two outcomes that Steve didn't mention. and I put them in parentheses because they were not the pre-selected outcomes. Basically, they looked at so many different outcomes for so many different comparisons that it was really important to pre-select ahead of time which ones you were going to pay attention to. Otherwise, there's a chance that you end up picking up a significant outcome just because of chance, right? So these two were not part of the reductions in crowding and improvement in housing quality were not part of those pre-selected measures, but they were statistically significant, and it's part of the same story about general benefits of the housing subsidy. There were also benefits for other things. The red are the benefits for adult well-being that Steve talked about. The green are the benefits for children. The blue are the kind of the mixed effects of economics here, reductions in employment, but improvements in food security and a reduction in economic distress. Again, economic distress being not one of the pre-selected outcomes. Okay, so quickly, the context for this, which is what we're kind of going to get to in the next panel. There's been a lot of attention focused on how housing makes a difference for a whole variety of non-housing outcomes. Part of this is due to research that's been going on for many years, but it's really been accelerated in recent years by a major investment of funding from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. There's also been some convergence with research that's happening independently in the child development field and the health field. I've been particularly impressed to see this notion of health in all policies framework coming out of the health field that's really being very open to looking at housing interventions outside of the doctor's office can make a difference in health. And that's pointing back towards housing and many other things. I wish we were seeing something similar in education, maybe in a few years. Okay, two studies. I just want to very, very quickly tick through, and then we'll get to our first panel. The family option study, one of the things that makes it unique is that it was a rigorous randomized trial. There have been only a handful of other rigorous randomized trials in the housing world, period, and only a handful that, even smaller handful that actually touch on these issues. I'm going to talk about two of them. One is the effect of vouchers on welfare family study that Abt Associates did in the early 2000s. Basically randomized a group of welfare families or welfare eligible families to get housing vouchers, similar in this case, except a different population, right? Instead of homeless families, we're looking at welfare families, but very similar housing outcomes. Right, substantial improvements in all variety of housing outcomes, reduction in homelessness, crowding, and moving. So that's it's encouraging to see two studies come up with very similar results. The labor effects, though, were the same initially as in the family option study. There was a short-term reduction in earnings and employment in the group that was offered a housing voucher, but those effects were temporary. They disappeared within a year to 2 years, and over the full 3.5-year follow-up period, they were statistically insignificant. That's important because that's been a similar outcome in a number of other studies that have looked at this. In fact, most studies have found those outcomes to be short-term. Okay? There is one notable exception in Chicago, but other than that, I think most of the well-done studies have found this sort of short-term outcome that disappears. And no effects on educational outcomes, which was disappointing, I think. There was a thought that having a housing voucher would lead to stability of residential stability, which would lead to school stability, which would lead to educational outcomes, but that wasn't found. Now, for me, this raises a number of questions that would be useful, I think, to think about in the context of the family option study. Here's where I'm really going to struggle to read what's across the way. The first is this question of whether we really need to be thinking differently about how we promote employment and earnings for people in subsidized housing. We know that just getting a voucher by itself does not help. It may actually have a short-term negative impact. Over the long run, maybe it disappears, but it's certainly not positive. It should be positive. We would think it would be positive. There's some reasons to think it would be positive. Steve mentioned there's some reasons to think it's negative. Maybe those things are canceling each other out. But at a minimum, we need to be thinking differently about this. Second, it is important perhaps to be thinking more about the role of location in affecting educational outcomes. The welfare housing study found there were some modest improvements in location, but not enough to really impact school quality in a material way. And then another question that's nagging at me is whether 3 years is really enough to find the outcomes that we care about, particularly for children, right? Because these things sometimes take time to manifest. Speaking of long-term outcomes and long-term studies, a second study I just want to set a context. Again, it's another rigorous randomized study. This one, in this study, it's different from the others in that everybody had housing assistance at baseline. right? Everyone was in public housing. One group got a housing voucher along with services and a requirement that were designed to help them locate in low poverty areas. Second group got just a housing voucher with no constraints, no counseling. A third group was the control group. So this was really meant to be a study of location. What did we find? On the primary outcomes that people were focused on adult earnings and child educational outcomes, there were no effects. Right? We can talk about why. Some people would say they didn't move to low enough poverty neighborhood. Some would say they didn't stay there long enough. But in any event, no experimental findings. There were some findings in things that were a little bit surprising and perhaps not quite as anticipated. There were reductions in extreme obesity and diabetes. They were clinically significant. It's been an article published in the New England Journal of Medicine looking at that. There were reductions in psychological distress that, again, may affect the parenting pathway, potentially could also affect children. In terms of the direct results of youth, they were kind of mixed by gender. Most recently, and I'm sure many of you have seen this in the papers, Raj Chetty, Larry Katz have done a study looking at the effects on the next generation. What difference did it make on the children who grew up in households that were offered the opportunity to move to low poverty neighborhoods? Very interesting study looking at matching with IRS records. We should all be so lucky to have access to that kind of data. But what they found basically was that children in the experimental group, the one that got the location restricted voucher and the services to move to low poverty areas, if they were younger than 13, there were statistically meaningful effects on their employment as young adults and on the likelihood that they went to college and on the quality of the college attended. There was no difference, and actually a decline, although not a significant one, for children over 13, right? Suggests that it matters a lot sort of when you move into this area and the follow-up period. You have to be there. You have to be exposed to it for some period of time for it to have its effect. So what are the takeaways for the study? One is we really need to perhaps to be thinking about a really long-term perspective. It's great to be able to look at the next generation. We don't obviously always have that luxury, but now in this era of being able to match databases, we may increasingly be able to do that. A second outcome, I would say, from the Moving to Opportunity study is an increased interest in the relationship of housing and physical and mental health. Right? These were not necessarily outcomes that were pre-selected ahead of time in the MTO study, but if you look at the family option study, we did look at physical and mental health in part because of the MTO findings, and at least on the mental health side, there were some statistically significant effects. We're still waiting on physical health. On the employment side, my takeaway is there's no quick fix. Just giving someone a voucher doesn't lead to increased employment. Just helping them access a low poverty neighborhood doesn't move to help them necessarily increase their earnings. There are some HUD-focused interventions. One of them is called the Family Self-Sufficiency Program. Another is called Jobs Plus. These are interventions that are housing-based that are designed to help people increase their earnings. HUD is presently studying the Family Self-Sufficiency Program. I believe it's about to launch a study also of MTO. So stay tuned. There'll be some new results coming down the pike. And finally, as I mentioned, this issue of pre-selecting outcomes, I think, is an important one. And I really applaud the researchers in this case. They really are sticking with their pre-selected outcomes, given how many big outcomes there are. It doesn't mean we should ignore the other outcomes when they're part of the story, but it does mean when you're really trying to say what's the litmus test for whether this made a difference, when you have over 700 pairwise comparisons, I think that's a number here. It's some huge number. It's important really ahead of time to say, what do you think is going to make a difference? So you're kind of binding yourself to the mast, right, Odysseus? So you're able to say with some credibility whether the intervention had the effect that you hoped it would. So with that, we're going to move to the next panel. Unfortunately, Yana Kachoris, who was invited, was ill this morning and not able to attend, so I will be filling in. I don't look like Yana. I'm not from the MacArthur Foundation. I'll do my best to channel, however, her point of view. So I'd like to welcome the first panel to the stage, moderated by Ron Haskins. Ron is a senior fellow and holds the Cabot Family Chair in Economic Studies at the Brookings Institution, where he co-directs the Center on Children and Families and the Budgeting for National Priorities Project. He's also a senior consultant at the Annie E. Casey Foundation and is president-elect of the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management. Ron Haskins.
So the topic of this panel is how housing matters to children and families. I think that's the most important question. Let me just make a few introductory comments. And then we're going to have an opening statement from each of the panelists, which are in your program, Aletha Houston-Stein from the University of Texas.
That shows how long you've known me.
Well, she's still in Texas.
I've been used Stein for about 40 years.
And then Sandra Newman from Johns Hopkins, and Yana. Changed so much, you know.
We all grow up.
Yeah. Yana has a 2-year-old, and they both got sick, so that's understandable that she could not come from Chicago. And Jeff will capably sit in for her. Though, let me just make this few observations. The first thing is random assignment is to die for. We need way more random assignment studies than we have. We should triple, quadruple. It's the only truly reliable source of information from the social sciences. All the rest leads to mischief because it fits with people's perceptions. They pick the results they like, and they tell you a story which is usually not correct. So that's why random assignment is so important. So the results from this study are highly reliable. And fortunately, a second point about this study is that they did decide to measure outcomes other than just housing issues, stability, and so forth. And so we have information about what actually happened to the kids and the families involved, and that is what we want to focus on this panel. So we'll begin with Aletha, who has 5 minutes to make an opening statement. There's a timekeeper right there. She's quite nasty as an individual when you go over your time, so when 5 minutes comes up, you better stop.
Got it. Thank you, Ron. Well, my assignment in this talk is to talk about the child development aspects of it because I'm not an expert on housing. And I think there are 2 major points that come out of these findings. First, and I'm going to focus entirely on the subsidized permanent housing results because that's where the results are. That intervention influenced children's environments in a number of ways that we would expect. We've got people over here. We would expect to have positive effects on children. There's a literature out there on chaos, for example. And chaos, one aspect of chaos is instability. Well, this study reduced instability not only in housing, but in school attendance, in child care attendance. So it reduced instability in a number of ways for children. The other aspect of chaos is disorder or disorganization. And I might add that there's some research showing that chaos is not just poverty. These effects occur above and beyond poverty. Some people put it that poverty is a lack of resources, but chaos is an inability to access whatever resources you have. And the findings on reduced crowding and on better quality of housing also suggest that the disorder, disorganization, and so on that constitute risks for children's development were reduced in this study. I'll take a quick look here. So that there's a lot of reason to think that these environmental changes, just in stability and disorder and so on, might influence children positively. A second very important pathway is through parenting. The parents had lower levels of psychological distress and economic stress, which all the literature would lead us to think that they would be more nurturant, more able to be good parents to their children. One thing that hasn't been emphasized is a reduction in partner violence. And half of these families had experienced intimate partner violence within, I believe it was a year prior to the time that the baseline data were collected. That's a lot of reasons why people end up in shelters is because of domestic violence. Well, domestic violence and partner violence has very clear negative effects on children. So to the extent that was reduced, it's another reason to think that this should be positive. Health and safety, there was less food insecurity. They were just getting more food to eat. And maybe exposure to toxins. So there's all these good things about the environmental changes that happened. Second point is that there were no effects, and I really think it's no effects, on any of the measures of child or adolescent development. So here we've got these gradient changes in the environment. We're not seeing anything when we measure what happened to the children. And this is across measures of cognitive development, a lot of personality, mental health, social behavior issues, grades, there were scattered findings, but basically I would say they're nil. And so you have to ask why. And I think there are two possible, I mean, maybe there were no effects, but assuming that we've got all this environmental change, why wouldn't we be seeing something good coming out of it? One aspect, one reason may be that this range of age from infancy to age 17 means that we need to look a lot more carefully at age-based findings, because most of the data are consistent with what Jeff suggested, that these effects happen because of early childhood environments. Early childhood poverty is a much more long-term effect than later poverty. The Moving to Opportunity program just found that early experience with moving had a positive effect on later adult performance. So there are a lot of reasons to think that the early childhood period is the one where we would expect to see findings. And secondly, 18 months may be too soon. It may take longer to see findings coming out for children, and 36 months may not be enough either, by the way, because these things don't change fast. You know, kids' cognitive levels don't change that fast. Their social behavior doesn't change that fast. And a lot of the findings that are seeing long-term effects, for example, in Head Start and some of the early interventions, are showing later effects in adulthood, even after it appears they have been fade out before that time.
So thank you. Nicely done.
Very nicely.
Sandy Newman.
I'm coming from a completely different angle on this. I actually am sitting here still very impressed by the video screen on the water faucet in the ladies' room. I've never seen that before. Welcome to the museum. So some of you know me. For those who don't, I've been a housing researcher for actually more than 4 decades. So I'm clearly very committed to this topic area. And maybe because I've been toiling in these fields for such a long time, that I think the proper perspective for me to bring to the discussion today is one of a friendly skeptic. So on the one hand, it's very impressive how much really excellent research in the housing and housing-related topic area has been done, particularly in the last decade and a half, 2 decades. And much of this has been supported. We have a very small arena of funders. Very grateful to HUD's PD&R and, in fact, to the MacArthur Foundation. And as many of you know in this room, that arena is now undergoing shrinkage as MacArthur winds down its major commitment to housing research. So we're going to be in worse shape going forward than in the past. On the other hand, in a more negative light, I think we have a very long way to go to build an evidence base that we have sufficient confidence in that we would be willing to use it to really propose major changes in policy that will directly affect millions of people's lives. And why do I say this? Jeff sort of broached the topic in his presentation. One indicator clearly is that take almost any fundamental question about the role of housing in people's lives, children, adults, whatever, you will find very mixed, very inconsistent findings. Partly this is for the reason that Ron mentioned, that observational studies are different from random assignment studies. But it is quite sobering to look across, as I've done many, many times to try to make sense of this myself, and to see that for every study that finds a positive effect, I can find one that has nil effect or a negative effect. Another indicator is that we do not have a culture, not only in the housing field, but I would venture to say in the social science research field, social policy research in general, of replication. That is that in scientific development, what you want to see is multiple researchers looking at the same question and trying to replicate results. And when you get that body of replication, you feel confident that you have actually found what you ought to do about the problem. I think that there are a number of things we can do to remedy the situation. I'll just give you 2 examples. One of them, and this is something that is not very sexy to talk about, but I think if we do not attend to this, we'll always be in the same situation, and that is to develop what I have referred to as a minimum data set on housing. These would be measures that are tested for their reliability and their validity. They would be tested for different populations, longitudinally, and so on, and take account of many of the variations that Jeff very correctly pointed out, nonlinearities and so on. So having this minimum data set, first of all, we would then have something that we could all use, and it would also be available to our colleagues from other fields in social policy. And if it's small enough, it could be incorporated in general social surveys and new surveys that are done by colleagues such as Aletha, so that there would be many more opportunities to look at the role of housing in people's lives. A second is that I think the Family Option Study is a perfect example of a very well-designed study directed to answer a very clear policy question. We can count on one hand the number of studies that meet that criterion. We, as researchers, have tried to be very resourceful to eke what we can out of existing surveys that have very inadequate housing data. They may have very rich other data, and we sort of stand on our head to try to work with these data, maybe do a GIS address match and so on, so that we can eke out whatever is possible from those studies. But the truth of the matter is that these questions are important and fundamental, and I don't think we're ever going to get there until we decide what the most important ones are and we design studies to answer them.
Good, thank you very much. Jeff has graciously agreed to forego his 5 minutes since he just had half an hour. So thank you for that. But please jump in anytime. I will ask you some questions in a minute. Let's start with Aletha. The first thing I want to know is, can you give us a summary, give the audience a summary of what we know about neighborhood effects and especially quality of housing and stability of housing in general, not just in this study, but in general. How does this study fit into the literature on the effects of these other measures on children's development or families, either one?
Well, there's those three components of housing, at least in the literature with which I'm familiar, are often not studied together. So there's a neighborhood literature, which really has to do with things like poverty in the neighborhood, violence, crime, other sorts of neighborhood quality issues. And Greg Duncan and Jean Brooks-Gunn published 2 or 3 volumes on it some years ago. And there's a continuing literature showing, I would say, modest, but not huge effects of the quality of neighborhood on things like school achievement, adolescent delinquency, and whatnot. As Jeff mentioned, the Moving to Opportunity study, which was probably the only random assignment really study that I know of attempting to experimentally manipulate neighborhood. Well, yeah, it followed on the Gautreaux study, but that was not a random assignment study. Found what appeared to be, for a long time, very disappointing results, frankly, and I think overall, but particularly for children.
There were pretty good effects on adolescent girls, though, right?
Yeah, but it seems like, I think we really do have the problem there of how many things did we measure and how many different subgroups were examined, and I've never felt especially the ethnographic data didn't really jibe with the survey data in all cases, and so I've never felt very comfortable about generalizing from that study. I think the Raj Chetty and Larry Katz's work recently that followed the younger kids not only makes theoretical sense, but it seems to me to be more readily interpretable because it really does find experimental effects that are pretty clear. So that's neighborhood. I really don't know, and Sandy maybe can answer this question better than I can. I don't know of much on instability per se outside the chaos question literature, and that's usually looking more at instability within the household as a negative effect on children. So this is offering, I think, a new perspective on that there isn't a lot of literature on. Maybe you know more.
Thank you. Sandra.
So,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no.
I was just going to
that's good.
chime in on the stability point. So there's absolutely no argument that for the families presumably studied in the family option study who are way at the end of a continuum in terms of homelessness, complete instability, you are getting, I think, very good read on getting them housed and adding some stability. But most of the literature is not about homeless families. It's about a much broader continuum of lower income families with kids. And there is quite a large literature. It's not per se on housing stability. It's on residential mobility or on school mobility. And colleagues and I have recently taken a close look at this literature. And this is an example of what I was talking about in my opening remarks. So this literature faces a huge hurdle, which we refer to as omitted variables, that families that make moves, children that make moves, may have various features about them that are not measured in the study, and that therefore we are overestimating the impact of the move itself, when in fact what is operating is something else about this family. And the very strong evidence that this is the case is that we've sort of arrayed the literature, and anytime we come to a stronger study that has done a better job at controlling for these additional features, the effects of mobility on children's outcomes declines substantially, becomes insignificant, and we have even found instances where it becomes positive. And as Jeff mentioned, there are good moves, quote unquote, and there are bad moves. The other thing about this literature that is very important to keep in mind is that there are different types of mobility. Jeff again alluded to this. You can move the house, which may involve a school move, and it may not. You can move the child's school, which may involve moving where you live, it may not. And you can have both or so on. So the operationalizing this of what are we actually talking about here, and the timing of the move, as we know, moving during the school year can be more stressful than moving between years, needs to be taken into account. The timing of the move with regard to the child's developmental period can be very important. The number of moves that the family actually is making over what period of time can be very important. So these are just, these are common sense when you sit down to think about this. These are the kinds of things you would like to take into account in a study of this sort. There are really very, very few that have been able to do that kind of control for all of those factors.
Jeff, you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I do. It's been a really useful conversation, I think it all makes a lot of sense. I would just add two things. One is, I do think we sometimes in this area of stability suffer from the problem of mixing up what we can measure versus what the actual issue is. So we often measure the number of times a family moves, but if you're moving because your parent got a job and now they're going to be making a lot more money, or you're moving to a better school district, those could be good moves, right? But if you're moving because, all of a sudden your landlord locked the door because you couldn't pay your rent and you have to sort of go find an apartment immediately, that's a very different kind of move. So we need to develop a better measure of stability that really zeroes in on the issue of not just how many times family moves, but the circumstances in which they move. Do they have control over whether and under what circumstances they're moving? Second important issue is, let's focus not just on the people who are moving, but on the other children that are in those schools. We know there are certain schools with hypermobility, kids constantly moving through, and so by the end of the year, only half the kids were there in the beginning. The question is not just what's the effect on the children who move, but what's the effect on the other children who are there? And maybe it's easier to control for some of the variables, Sandy, that you're talking about. Obviously, we're measuring a different thing, but to look at the people who are left over, and to what extent is attention being diverted from them to these children who are moving so that these other children are doing less well in school.
Okay, Sandy, let's go back to your dissent somewhat. If I have a lot of experience working with policymakers, if they asked me about this study, I'd say it's quite an interesting study, a very high quality study. And it found that if you tell a family we're going to give you money indefinitely, and you get a house, you can be confident you're going to have this subsidy for time immemorial. And that seemed to have an effect on the families. It did better than a bunch of other conditions, all of which involved at least less permanency. And the families, of course, were less stable where they lived. There were effects on the adults that were good for the family that had stability, even less family violence. There were no effects on the kids, but there were effects on conditions that we know in the long run would influence kids, like fewer changes of schools, fewer changes of housing, and so forth. Do you doubt that? Would you dissent from what I would told that policymaker? Therefore, we should cover more than 1 out of 4, or whatever it is.
With regard to the population studied, I think that this is an extremely strong study. I am very interested in the 36-month results. I think that's a very, that's why you're doing it. It's an important thing to see how things change. Sometimes the expectation is that the results will strengthen, but sometimes positive results get diluted as families change their circumstances over time. So I think positive but cautious. But again, I want to emphasize, this is a very different population from the one that we are typically talking about. I also want to emphasize something that was said maybe by Steve.
Wait, before you do that, hold it. I want to just, because I don't think it was emphasized enough in the summary of the study. Okay. So all the subjects were already homeless. They came from shelters, and they had to have been there 7 days, so it was not just a one-night kind of deal. So you are talking about a really disadvantaged population with serious problems. So it might not generalize. I thought that's what you're going to say.
It is.
Point out to him that this is not all low-income families.
Right, exactly. And I mean, very impressive take-up rate of the voucher for the subgroup, right? We know, well, MTO, of course, the constrained experimental group, which had to move to less than 10% poverty neighborhood, the take-up rate was less than 50%.
That's right.
For the Section 8 group, it was low 60%. So we know that this is really extraordinary. I can't remember what it was, Danny. Was it like 70, 80, 85? So just extraordinary.
You said 84% take up, so that's a big difference.
Really, and
suggesting again how disadvantaged they are, and even desperate.
But the MTO people already had a subsidy functionally. They all did, because they lived in public housing.
Right.
Well,
so they aren't the typical population either.
That's exactly right.
Right.
That's exactly right.
But they're, on average, less disadvantaged in this population.
Presumably, yeah, presumably.
Okay. All right, so I guess your attitude is skeptical.
I mean, positive. It's very positive, but long term. I mean, I'm not going to go to the Chetty right now. We may get to the Chetty later, but Chetty and colleagues. But I think it's extremely impressive. Certainly an argument that in the short run, you do see these positive results. That's fairly cost neutral when you take everything into account. So crafting an argument of that sort, fine. The question of what happens long term, because we do know that in experiments, sometimes you see an erosion over time.
You want anything add to this?
No, I think it's appropriate to be positive but skeptical. Particularly, I would imagine the cost data are not going to be the same at 36 month as they are at 20 month, as Steve emphasized. So I wouldn't make an argument only based on that. But I would say this, one thing that's important is that the outcomes for housing stability that we found were very similar in the welfare to work voucher study, the study of the effect of giving vouchers to people who are on welfare, qualified for welfare. We do so few studies. Here's actually a case where we've replicated results in 2 studies for different contexts and had very, very similar results. So I think that does give us some confidence that at least the housing stability outcomes are things we can rely on. Cost issue, I think we need to take a look at, and I would definitely argue for longer term follow-up if we can afford it. I'm very worried, particularly for child outcomes, that we're not, it's just not a long enough period.
You've got to look at them by age group.
Yes, absolutely.
I don't recall really seeing much about quality of neighborhood here, and I think we sort of mentioned that we assume most of these people are moving into pretty poor neighborhoods.
My understanding is that we
those
have the data, but they have not yet been analyzed, but
Right.
hopefully they will be in subsequent studies. But it's a very good question.
I wouldn't guess that that's a major reason for the positive effects here.
That would be our assumption. If anything, it could be a countervailing issue.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm back to talking to members of Congress again. This time they're Republicans. And I tell them all this good stuff that Sandy accepts and everybody here is impressed by for good reason. And then I add, oh, by the way, they were more likely to get TANF, they were more likely to get food stamps, and they were less likely to work. Therefore, they became more dependent on public benefits. What would you respond if you were their president and wanted to soften the blow somewhat? Because, you know, Republicans are going to be ferocious about that.
Well, of course yeah. Well, I'll let Sandy and the other people talk about the fact that those effects may, in fact, not be permanent, that there may be a recovery there, but also that we have to think about the fact that there is a lot of cost to keeping children. These are among the very most deprived children, the children who are going to have the most problems going forward that are going to cost us a lot of money, if they're not already costing us a lot of money. And so it may be very cost effective, and we have a lot of data to suggest that it is, to invest something, especially in the younger kids' well-being, to avoid those high costs.
Okay, here's another finding that doesn't fit with the one that I just mentioned to this Republican congressman. And if I were sitting there listening to myself, I'm going to say, hey, but Haskins is leaving out something really important. There was another big random assignment study called Job Plus done by MDRC, and they had a big impact on work among people that got a housing benefit. And that's despite the fact that the control group, this was during the era of welfare reform when work rates among low-income mothers were skyrocketing, the control group, this will show you why we need control groups, is going up like mad. And yet the experimental group goes up even more. And the reason probably is, and I'd love to hear your comments about this, that there was actually an incentive to work, specifically to work, and it had to do with we've talked about this 30% out of your income that you have to pay if you're in housing, either public housing or Section 8. And they reduced that 30%, so there was actually a financial incentive for people to take jobs, and they did. They took jobs. So maybe this finding in your study could be dealt with through a policy mechanism. What do you think of that?
Well, I guess I'd want to know a lot more about what other effects there were under those circumstances. But surely, I mean, this is true in a lot of the welfare to work literature and in New Hope that I was very much involved in, that having financial incentives to work, but they came out of the public purse, I might point out, did improve people's employment to some degree, improve their income to some degree, not hugely. So that I don't know that that particular way of doing it would be the best way, but certainly one could think more broadly across policy areas, as either Steve or Jeff said, I've forgotten, about integrating these different interventions. It doesn't appear that whatever they did in the other interventions tested here, however, had any positive effects.
Right. You want to say anything about
Yeah,
this?
well, for Jobs Plus, I agree, very impressive. The story with Jobs Plus, though, is that it was a package of service. It wasn't just one thing. Right. And I apologize because I haven't read it in probably the last 3 years. I don't recall that analyses were done that actually allowed Jim Riccio and his colleagues to tease out which of the package made the biggest difference, whether they had variation in, I know they had variation in the quality of the intervention in the different sites. So there's a bigger story there that we'd need to dive into. One thing that is the case, and this point has been made by others before me, is that although housing assistance programs have lots of rules and regulations, there is nothing about the site and neighborhood standard in which you're going to be looking for a place to live with a voucher that has anything to do with accessibility of jobs. So if we're really thinking about this seriously, that and there's a lot of discussion right now about location because of the recent decision under the Fair Housing Act and so on about what kinds of locations do housing programs operate in
anything to this?
should.
Yeah, I do. I think it's an extremely important question. I think people are right to be asking the question about earnings impacts. And I would say that it's important to recognize that we have not just Jobs Plus, but also another intervention called the Family Self-Sufficiency Program that actually serves a much larger group of households that is specifically designed to provide incentives and provide wraparound services, or maybe wraparound's a little exaggerated, provide services to help support families' increased earnings. The question is, do they work, right? We know that Jobs Plus worked in the 3 out of the 6 sites that effectively administered it. The fact that the others didn't suggests it may be challenging, and so right now HUD is actually funding the replication of Jobs Plus. There will be a study, so we will get a sense of to what extent, how easy it is to replicate that. But the other thing is that even the Family Self-Sufficiency Program is really only serving fewer than 5% of the non-elderly, non-disabled households in subsidized housing. What about the rest of them? And it seems to me we ought to be experimenting, I think, both with, so let's study the effects of family self-sufficiency, and that's being done right now through a very rigorous randomized study. But let's also investigate what would it take to build these kinds of supports into the very fabric of housing assistance so that everybody who walks in the door, in addition to getting a voucher, gets an earnings incentive as their earnings goes up, gets supports that they may need. There are a number of places, Cambridge and Portland in particular, that are using their sort of waiver authority to experiment with those. I'm actually working with one of them to help evaluate the effects of that. It's a really interesting idea. Sandy is completely right. Let's not change policy for millions of people until we understand the effects of this. But it's, I think, the kind of thing we need to be looking at, because there's, if we can neutralize the disincentive, there are reasons to think that housing may be positive for work, right? People are more stable. They don't have to worry about where they're going to sleep tomorrow. It's pretty hard to focus on getting a job when you're worried about where you're going to sleep tomorrow. So there may be some disincentives to work and some incentives to work that are kind of counteracting each other. And if we could figure out how to neutralize the disincentives, maybe, remains to be seen. But the hypothesis is we may be able to establish housing assistance as a positive platform for work, which perhaps it should be.
Not to mention that we have a work support system, earned income tax credit, additional child tax credit, daycare, and so forth, that really, in and of itself, provides great incentive to work up until you get to around 30,000, and it starts, you hit various cliffs, and it's not so good. Mm-hmm. Several people mentioned services. Here's a cynical interpretation of the broad results of this study. So if you give people money, government knows how to do that. And they might tell you can only use it on certain things, as they did in this case. You have to spend on housing. But if it involves services, forget it. They can't do it. Services are no good. You give them the money and hope for the best. What do you think of that interpretation?
Well, in this particular study, services are confounded with the length of the housing assistance, for one thing, and with the kind of housing assistance that you get. And one of the points that was made in the study is that with, I think it was with rapid rehousing, you lost your assistance fairly quickly. So on the one hand, they're giving you services. On the other hand, they're making it harder for you to
But wait, before
proceed.
you go further,
But on the whole, I would agree with you.
Yeah.
These services did not work.
Right. So I'm taking a slight exception to the way you frame that, only because it's my understanding that the theory of the rapid reemployment and the services is that if you can get them temporary housing and then give them services, you can cure them and heal them, and they will rise up and start to work and be independent and all that. It didn't happen. That's why
right.
I'm short.
Well, I mean, would anybody be surprised that in 6 months you don't make major changes? And
Every social worker in the country. What do you think, Sandy?
Well, this is also the case for the transitional housing, which has services built into it. So I'm very impressed by how detailed reading Letha did of this huge study. I don't recall how much analysis you actually did of the quality of the services in the different sites, and not much. Okay, so would depend on we need to know more about it because there may be very poor services being offered. But there have been other studies also that have found that the transitional housing model is not the best for particular groups of homeless, those with mental illness, for example.
Aletha, are you?
Yeah, I do think that there's evidence in the welfare and employment literature that services vary hugely, and there's even across welfare offices the degree to which there are different kinds of emphases and attitudes, and again in the New Hope study, which many of you may or may not be familiar with, but one of the things that people talked about quite a lot in that study was respectful services. And those services were not, okay, we're going to make you into something. They were, we're here to provide you information for, if you want to find a job, we'll try to help you find a job. If you're looking for childcare, we'll try to help you find childcare. But it was done in a way that at least the participants thought was enormously helpful. And I personally think it was one of the reasons why there were a lot of positive effects on the families.
Okay, we're almost out of time before we go to the audience, so you have 1 minute to answer this question. If you were in charge of the 36-month follow-up at APT, what would you focus on? What's your advice to APT about what they should look at next?
Well,
in this study,
I would look at the young kids much more intensively. And
say a little bit more. You got 45 seconds at least. I mean, what measures? How would you try?
Well, I mean, they have measures. You know, they have to work with what they have. But one would expect from all the literature that I know of on poverty effects and other kinds of effects that you would see the greatest effects on the children who are preschool age when this intervention happens, and not so great effects, certainly not great effects on adolescents. So if I had one thing to do, that's what I would recommend they do.
You should say, get access to school records if you possibly can.
Yes.
Right? Because
yeah.
you don't have to collect the data, it's there. Administrative data is
absolutely,
a key
and it's possible.
And I'm assuming you do have, knowing APT, I'm sure you have links via Social Security number or other links for lots of administrative data. So, I mean, this is the way of the world because even though it's tremendously labor intensive, it's a lot less expensive than going out with personal surveys. So, of course, we're all very interested in what happens to families, both who retain the voucher, because it's going to be somewhat unusual if they retain it beyond the median length that most families hold a voucher. It's much less time than people tend to think. And, of course, what happens to the families who move elsewhere. And I didn't see that much on the characteristics of the housing unit or on the neighborhood, which it sounds like you'll at least rely on census and ACS data for some of those characteristics. So I'm very interested in characterizing that residential setting. And then I agree, schools, childcare as well. And getting a sense of the, the market of opportunities that these very constrained families actually face in their locale, which is a particular interest, as Jeff was talking about. What trade-offs do lower-income families make when they're faced with this choice, but a very constrained choice?
Okay, audience, raise your hand. When I recognize you, stand up, tell us your name, and ask a question that's of fairly short duration, please. Otherwise, I've been collecting spitballs up here. I'm going to throw them at you once you pass 45 seconds or a minute. They're in the back. All the way in the back there.
Hi, everybody. My name is Li Ning. I work at Fannie Mae. I have a question about the study. You mentioned that you pick 20 locations, and I'm curious about the rationale about picking those 20. Is that purely based on statistics, like the top 20 locations with the highest homeless population, or are there some judgment call? Maybe, for example, availability of researchers at those locations to collect field data at that location.
Is she the app team?
Is there a
over
member
here
of the
talking?
study team who can answer?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
Danny can answer the question.
Danny Gubitz, Apt Associates. So there are 12 communities in the study, and they weren't randomly selected. So it was a sample of convenience. We were looking for wide geographical diversity. We also were looking for communities who would agree to be part of the study, because we were looking for all the different interventions in a community. That took a lot of doing. So. Yes. Oh, yes. And there needed to be, a high enough number of homeless families in the shelters to support the experiment.
I wanted to know if your study had been able to do any subgroup analysis on pregnancy outcomes, or if you were even tracking the number of women who were pregnant. I'm sorry. I'm Caitlin Cross Barnett. I'm from the CMS Innovation Center.
We should maybe leave a mic permanently around
with Danny.
the study team. Danny?
So no, we haven't looked at that. We do know who was pregnant at baseline at the time of enrollment into the study. We also know, which families, subsequently had a newborn. So we haven't looked at it yet.
But about whether or not there was preterm birth or low birth weight or anything about the outcomes for the infants, or no?
I think we know maybe just one outcome, which is birth weight, and I think. I'm forgetting. There were a lot of outcomes in the study. I think that outcome might be in the study right now.
Hillary Agarlo from the Corporation for Supportive Housing. I was just curious, we're talking a lot about stability, and in the 36-month follow-up, what does stability mean? Does that mean the family is going to be paying 30% of their income, they haven't moved, they're falling back into the system? I mean, I think that's kind of a big question on how are we measuring stability, and what does that mean? I know that's probably a longer answer than...
So, Hillary, my understanding is that we're measuring stability as an outcome, not as I had it, as a characteristic of the housing situation. So they're looking at how often people moved. They're looking at...
and they move less in the subgroup.
Right.
The one that got
they move less in the subgroup. They're also... they looked at housing quality. They looked at crowding. Those are the three main ones, right? Yeah. But they did not look at a subjective measure of stability, whether people, why they moved, right? There are a lot of questions that I think we would really need to do some qualitative follow-up to really unpack. And actually, that was going to be my answer if you asked me. What I would love to see some better understanding of how people actually responded. And why was it that a lot of households were able to avoid going back to shelter even without any particular intervention, whereas others sort of returned to shelter? Is there some way we can unpack that issue?
Good morning. I'm Felicia Stovall, and I'm from the Department of Healthcare Finance. And I just wanted to make a quick comment. This is such a good workshop because within the Department of Healthcare Finance, we are also trying to deal with the homelessness population within the managed care organizations. And one of the barriers that we're finding is the sharing of information and data across agencies. So I think we also need to, when you were talking about services, if you can't share the data with one another, that's a major barrier, especially for mental health and substance abuse. And we're finding challenges in that area where here in the district, you must have consent from the individual person before you can give them services. So that is a major complication. And even in the school system, you also have to abide by the FERPA regulation for children. So again, it's very complicated to get services for some of the individuals if we can't share the information. So that was just one of the comments I wanted to make.
And for those of you who follow FERPA, what an exciting abbreviation that is, it could get a lot worse very quickly. Congress is considering some really draconian restrictions on who gets access to education records, and we have a huge literature now on very, very good studies. The quality of education research, I think, has improved so dramatically, and one of the big reasons is because the access to administrative records, and that is it's going to be a big problem if that happens. So if you can get the administrative data from school records, do it fast. Okay, another question from the audience right over here.
Thank you. Linda Couch with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. This might be sort of a follow-up to Hillary's question. In Steve's initial overview of the report, it was clear that the permanent subsidy made a lot of significant impact, but why didn't it go down to virtually zero for going back to shelter, doubling up, excessive cost burden, whatever those other indicators were? And I'm interested to know if you're going to be looking at how the voucher program could be improved, because I think the voucher program, you would hope, has the power to get those numbers almost down to zero.
That is a great question. Sandy, you want to say something about it?
Well, I mean, I
we'll
should defer to
them next.
I mean, Jeff touched on it, Steve touched on it. It's the heterogeneity of the population. You know, there are some people within the sample that have all sorts of issues, and for them, it was impossible to sustain the use of the voucher. Is that correct?
The other thing that's important is, so these are intent to treat results, right? And so we are looking at everybody in the group that was offered a voucher, regardless of whether or not they actually got one. So the take-up of the voucher was 84%. That means there were 16% of people who were in that group who were not. So potentially, we could look at this actually, a lot of the people who were ending up at shelter were people who were not given a voucher. The other issue that I think will be more significant over the long term is to what extent people keep their vouchers. We know there's a fair amount of churning in and out of the voucher program. That's a big open question as to what extent people are able to keep their voucher over the long term.
Does anybody else from APP want to say anything about this?
Can I ask a question? Do you know about the 16% that, what was their problem that they could not use the voucher?
We are doing some separate analysis of just the subsidy group, and in order to see how they used subsidy, how use rates varied across communities, in what sequence did they use vouchers, and we're also looking at people who, while they were not randomized to get priority access to a voucher, they nonetheless found their way to a voucher and used it. So we are doing a deeper dive into, you know, how subsidy intervention actually works for these families.
And can I also ask, did the 84%, did they have substantial help from either the housing assistance system or any other system to help them get the voucher and use it?
We think that they had substantial help from the emergency shelter staff.
Wow.
And that was when I'm getting through the process of applying for the voucher. We don't really know that they had help negotiating with landlords to use the voucher, but we think some of them did that because, as you know, as others have said, this was a really high rate. And it's an even higher success rate if you look at the percentage of all those who actually got the voucher who were able to lease up. It's phenomenally high compared to earlier studies. So we think that people did get help from the shelter staff.
I just think that's important because given that this is such a disadvantaged population, the fact that the rates are so high, it's a little disconnect there. So how did they become so successful?
Lisa Sturdivant from the National Housing Conference and the Center for Housing Policy. It's so interesting to hear this discussion about a random assignment experiment. As we've talked about, they're quite rare. And as you've said, Dr. Haskins, this random assignment is the gold standard. And as Dr. Newman's mentioned, this idea of having replicable studies and having information that we're sure about before we change policy that affects thousands of people. But how would you respond to these thoughts that random assignment studies are really expensive, they're really time-consuming, replicability is really difficult given all the things we can't measure. How do we, as folks who may want to make changes to policy, what's our next best option? Or should there be a next best option when we're thinking about making changes that we hope improve outcomes without having this gold standard that we all wish we had?
Okay, I'm going to say something about this. And
you go ahead, I'm happy to chime in too.
There's a serious movement afoot to develop much less expensive and much quicker random assignment studies. The Laura and John Arnold Foundation actually has an award that used to be from Coalition for Evidence-Based Policy, and now they've kind of merged because John's the vice president there. John Barron was head of the coalition. And they give out grants specifically to explore how you can set up these experiments. And I can tell you, one of the biggest keys, administrative data. So you don't have to collect the data. That's one of the big expenses. But I think there will always be a place for, I mean, we had the field of housing policy for all these years, and there's so little that we knew for sure. That's my impression of reading reviews and so forth. And Sandy hasn't said anything to change my mind about that. So I think there will always be a place, there will always be expensive, but if we can hold it to the extent that we can hold it down and develop new techniques, that will be good. Let me tell you something else. Last year, Bank One, or one of the big banks, performed 10,000 random assignment experiments. And we need to get to that place in the social sciences, maybe not 10,000, but we need hundreds of random assignment experiments. And if you can do it with administrative data, it will dramatically reduce the costs. I'll give you a great example from business. Subway. You heard of $5 footlong? Some guy in California started that, and the guy that headed the franchise did not like it. And so they were working with a guy named Jim Manzi, who has a company called Applied Predictive Technologies. And Manzi said, we'll do a random assignment study, it'll be cheap. So they randomly assigned their franchises. Some of them sold the $5 footlong, others didn't. And here's what they found. As the president was concerned about, they sold fewer sandwiches when they were more expensive. Now, that's an amazing finding. You charge more. However, people who go in and get sandwiches got Coke, potato chips, cookies, and the Coke especially, I shouldn't say Coke, soft drink, is almost free, especially if they buy it out of those, big container kind of things. And the profit margin was greater for the franchise that had a $5 footlong. So business is way ahead of social science in this. We need to get with it, and the government agencies need to focus on this as much as possible so they can stretch a dollar and not give up these kind of long-term random assignment, but get more bang for the buck. Anybody want to add?
You did great. We have one more minute. Maybe we'll
Okay.
take one more.
All right. So who out there has a 15-second question? Nobody. We're done.
If they don't, I want to suggest one more thing.
Yeah.
I think the domestic violence issue is one that could be pursued here. I was really impressed with the fact that half of the people at baseline had experienced domestic violence in the last year. You could easily do some subgroup comparisons there, and I think that may be a really important individual difference or subgroup that we should be looking at.
Well, you used that minute well. All right, so now the next panel. Well, let me first of all thank this marvelous panel. Thank you. So Jill Kaduri from APT is now going to come up and have the second panel. She conducts research on homelessness and homeless assistance program and housing programs and strategies, among them the low-income housing tax credit. So Jill.
Well, that panel was certainly a hard act to follow, but we're going to follow it. The panel already got into asking questions of hypothetical policymakers about what would you do with these findings. Well, we now have a panel that has current policymakers. We have Kathy O'Regan, who is Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research at HUD. And we have Jennifer Canistra, who is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at HHS. We also have Kathy Stack, who's Vice President of Evidence-Based Innovation at the Arnold Foundation. We already heard about the Arnold Foundation. So I think that we can continue the conversation already started on how you take the evidence from the family option study and think about the implications for housing policy and also the implications for policy in other areas of domestic social policy. So let me begin by asking Kathy O'Regan to say a few words. Each of the panelists, again, will speak for, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, something like that, and then I'll ask a bunch of questions, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end.
Great. I think I may have a slide. And if I say that, does it magically appear?
Oh, there it is.
Fabulous. Oh, and now I see exactly what Jeff is talking about. Yes. When you're up here, you're very far away from it. And I really don't need that slide, but it might be helpful for those of you in the audience. A lot of the details of the study and even teasing out policy implications have been raised, so I'm going to be quick. And we were told 3 minutes. So I'm going to try to keep it to that. So I want to make just 3 points on thinking about what we can learn about policy from the study. The first is that high-level question, and Sandy said, you know, we asked a very specific policy question in this study, which is, how can we best use our limited housing resources to support homeless families? And I think on that question, we have very, very clear policy implications, right? So the first 3 bullets tell you sort of the key, remind you of the key findings. And what we know is that providing stable, affordable, permanent housing to families who are experiencing homelessness has a profound effect on housing stability and is our best policy option. Families want to use these vouchers, and they can use these vouchers. So a question that was being answered in this study is, what other types of services might be needed by homeless families in order to achieve housing stability? By far and large, housing is what these families needed to achieve that stability. They sustained it over the about 20 months follow-up. We'll learn more at 36 months. And we were able to achieve these big housing impacts, at about the same cost as the current usual care in the homeless shelters. In addition, and this wasn't known that we would have this impact, we had large, important, powerful impacts on non-housing outcomes. So that's the big line. If you're needing to give a message from the, I think it is 498-page report, that's the big takeaway. The second thing is to emphasize that last point about the non-housing impact. So this is the impact of housing subsidies on non-housing outcomes. I am not going to do as eloquent a job as the last panel did. Aletha did a fabulous job talking about the implications of those, right? So we've provided affordable housing, and it's had powerful impacts on a collection of domains in a child's environment that a whole body of research shows matter for other types of children outcomes. The stressing on the domestic violence and the chaos in the home, what we know about toxic stress, the fact that I think it was let me get the ACE acronym right. So the Adverse Childhood Experience Study focused on 7 components of a child's environment that have effect on physical and mental health outcomes as adults. 3 of those were significantly improved by the provision purely of a housing subsidy to homeless families. So the last bullet on the slide is that long view that was being talked about in the earlier panel, right? While we don't have that final evidence, as Sandy was pointing out, we do have all the precursors from a randomized study, precursor evidence of significant gains in the environment that these children are being exposed to that could have long-term implications for their adult well-being. Wow. So the point I want to make on that last one is, this audience, the coalition of the willing, should be much, much broader than those who care about housing, because these are the precursors to all of the disadvantages that we focus on in inequality in this country. And they start early, and housing has to be part of that conversation. So my very last point has to do with what we can learn from this study. When you do a randomized study, one of the biggest takeaways is, oh, did something work? Should we do more of it? Then you should spend years mining everything else that you can learn. There are lots of policy implications from this study. Several of them won't have to do with homelessness policy, right? So let's talk about that amazing success in lease-up among this population who were not provided from the PHA's additional services, but may have had services from the caseworkers in the homeless shelter. 84% lease-up. We should be learning about how to improve our voucher program, right? We have, and I'm going to go back to something Sandy said about how disadvantaged this population is. In a survey we did on PHA wait lists, families that waited a year, about half of them had experienced doubling up or homelessness in that year. We have a lot of similar households that we serve at HUD, but we don't have vouchers for them. So I think the implications there for improving all of our voucher programs would be great. The second piece on thinking about things that we may learn about has to do with that question of mobility that came up. It's not in the report, but is being followed up. We started out in 12 locations. At 20 months, 42 states. Families were found in 42 states who had started in this. We are going to learn a ton about how they move, where they move, and what else happens. And the last piece is, The data at the end of this study will be available for follow-on research. When you take the time to do the research right, then you've got this asset that should be a researcher public policy asset for learning as much as possible. So, okay, I'll end there.
Thank you, Kathy. Jennifer, you've also been thinking about the implications of the study. What would you like to say in your first few words?
Sounds great, thank you, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. At HHS, we clearly recognize the connection between housing, health, and human services, and this study certainly reinforces that connection. Secretary Burwell is currently Vice Chair of the Interagency Council on Homelessness, and next year in 2016, the final year of the administration, she will be Chair. So we have been thinking at HHS not just about our targeted homelessness programs, like the Administration of Children and Families Runaway and Homeless Youth Program, but also broader effects around domestic violence, child welfare, healthcare, and other issues. So this study helps some of the policies and issues we're already closely looking at. The biggest takeaway is one that we've known for a while and has been talked about a lot today, which is that there's a critical role of housing for vulnerable families. And similar to how other speakers have talked about the subsidy findings, that's also what I will touch on a little bit, and also reference sort of how HHS is thinking both in our programs and in steps we can take forward. So the first that I'll mention is one that was also mentioned, adult psychological distress. It seems obvious, but when you're a parent and you don't have to worry about how you will pay rent the next month or where you're going to sleep with your children the next night, you are going to have reduced stress in your life. And with that mental health off your shoulder, mental health concern off your shoulder, you have time to focus on other things, whether it's how to be a better parent or find a better job that might provide better economic security for you and your family, or how to flee an abuser if you're a victim of domestic violence. The second finding that I'll talk about is one that also has been referenced and one we're thinking about a lot at HHS, which is intimate partner violence. So the study found, just to reiterate it again, that subsidies reduced intimate partner violence in the last 6 months compared to usual care and rapid rehousing. It's an issue clearly when you're working with someone or know someone who's facing this. You want to do everything you can to help that individual. Secretary Burwell actually came back from a recent trip and turned to us and said, what are we doing to help domestic violence victims who need to get safe housing? And so it's certainly something at HHS with our colleagues at HUD that we're definitely looking into. We know emergency shelter for domestic violence victims is time limited because of resource constraints. So what other options are there? How can we provide a range of options, obviously leading up to the gold standard of a subsidy, but what can we do for these families who are facing this? Some things at HHS that we're thinking of, we know research supports partnerships between domestic violence resources and housing providers. So what can we do to sort of help that relationship on the local level so that there's more conversations and more unification of resources to help this population? And second, thinking about supportive services, what can we be doing as a government to provide the most helpful services for families that are experiencing this? And the last area that I'll touch on is the finding on child separation. The Family Options Study really reinforces that sometimes housing is the biggest barrier between a parent and a child separation. The study found that subsidies reduced child separation compared to usual care and transitional housing. Nationally, we know that 80% of child maltreatment victims are often neglected, not abused, and that highly correlates with poverty. So the study's findings suggest that we should have child welfare agencies look at creative ways to work with housing agencies and to try to get housing options to these individuals. That housing can have a huge impact on family separations and then also unifications. For example, in the administration, the President's FY 2016 budget, including funding, and also Senator Wyden actually just last month introduced a bill that has funds to help prevent placement into foster care and to provide post-placement services. The idea being that if you can flexibly support short-term rental assistance, then perhaps you can prevent these separations where it's appropriate and some of the outcomes that we know happen when foster care placements may take place. There's also a current Administration of Children and Families project focused on child welfare housing partnerships to provide supportive housing for certain child welfare involved families. And last, I know Kathy knows this, but the FY 2016 budget includes new family unification program vouchers, which would support partnerships between child welfare agencies and housing authorities to help child welfare involved families. So those are just three that I wanted to focus on that at HHS we've been thinking about how we can look at the policies we currently have and how we can do things somewhat differently. You know, we know this is just the first round of results and there'll be another round of results, and we've certainly heard from the last panel sometimes results can change. But at the same time, it is such a rich selection of data, and we certainly want to look at it closely to see if we should be doing things differently.
Thank you. Kathy Stack?
So I was introduced as working for the Arnold Foundation, but that's only for the last 5 months. Prior to that, I was at the Office of Management and Budget, working on mostly social services programs, but in a place where I was able to see the power of a really high quality random assignment study to shift the conversation. And so I'm not a researcher, I'm a consumer of research. I'm not a housing policy expert. So I'm going to just offer some thoughts from the lens of what I've seen in government and what the implications of this study are for me. First, I see, let me draw some parallels with home visiting. And I don't know how many of you have followed the policy on home visiting, but it's been a bipartisan initiative that started in the Bush administration to scale up evidence-based home visiting models. The Obama administration proposed a $10 million pilot to have dollars flow based on evidence. That was the Bush administration. The Obama administration proposed scaling that up, and we now have a $400 million a year initiative that is embedded within ACA. That has bipartisan support. And rolling the tape back to what triggered that, we discovered in the late part of the Bush administration that there were a number of models that had really, really rigorous evidence behind them, in particular the Nurse Family Partnership Program, which had looked at a particular intervention and found that using random assignment trials, it had significant impacts on multiple measures, not just looking at the mother's health or the child health. It was maternal and child health, but it looked at domestic violence, looked at employment outcomes, looked at school readiness outcomes. And it made us step back and say, okay, if we know that this model has such strong evidence behind it, but the way the dollars are flowing out to states, they're going to a whole range of models where people are making decisions at the state and local level based on what they've done before, past relationships, what they're used to. How can we shift the incentive structure and the program design so that we can drive more dollars to the models that work? And we ended up asking a series of questions that led us to a completely different program design that said, let's be neutral on what particular models will get money, but let's make sure we have a design that creates incentives for the dollars to flow to the interventions that work the best. And the design we ended up with that Congress has now established and is continuing has 75% of the money going to states that use evidence-based models that hit this very high standard. In general, they are supported by rigorous random assignment impact studies. And then 25% of the funds go to promising strategies that have preliminary evidence that they work, but we want to study them more. And we want to keep that innovation. So let me just say that the kinds of questions that you force yourself to ask when you have an impressive study is to start thinking about where we have compelling evidence, how do we drive more resources to it, where we have promising evidence, how do we spur more replication trials and getting people to think about how to do that together with practitioners and state and local governments on the ground, helping us build that evidence base. When we know something doesn't work, how do we create powerful incentives to redirect our resources away from that? It's often very hard to outright terminate something, but you can get people with strong evidence to walk away from things when you can point them to something else that works better. And I think we also ended up in a place where we started thinking creatively about how to build research practitioner partnerships on the ground, so that instead of thinking of research as this thing that happens over here and programs that happen over here, instead we've got a network of communities across the country where researchers and practitioners can come together, particularly where we can enable them to get access to administrative data so that they can do rigorous studies on their own, building evidence that can be aggregated up to the national level.
So Kathy O'Regan, how has HUD been using the evidence from the family options study, and how would you respond to Sandy Newman's skepticism about running with the results of a single study?
Well, the results for this study are pretty strong for a specific problem, which is family homelessness. And the way that you see this immediately in our policy is kind of twofold. The president's budget has requested 37,000 more vouchers, 23,000 of which would be dedicated to homeless families. And so that would be right in this space. We don't have a budget yet. Not sure when we're going to get a budget and whether those vouchers will be in the budget. So from the existing resources that we have, these results could influence public housing authorities to think about how they prioritize their resources and whether or not they give priority to families that are experiencing homelessness. I think that implication from this research is different than affecting millions that Sandy was talking about. And some of what I took in Sandy's conversation, because she was asked a broad question, which isn't just specifically what do we know from this study, but broadly about the effect of housing, and it's a pretty complicated answer. Does this wholesale change everything we're doing in housing? No, but it does tell us about our most powerful tool for homeless families.
Jennifer, you talked about partnerships, sort of following up on what Kathy just said. You talked about partnerships between child welfare agencies and housing agencies. How do you see that playing out? I mean, do you think that the child welfare agency is good, potentially, at identifying which families to prioritize for a voucher?
It's a great question. I mean, I'm sure there's variability kind of across agencies, across states. It's something that, I think at HHS we could certainly communicate, provide guidance, have conversations, technical assistance, and try to promote best practices or see what's working very well and promote that. It's hard to know, but I would say certainly, like as an ideal, we would want child welfare agencies to be able to know for this family, if we give them housing assistance, they are going to be able to stay together, and the child is not going to go to foster care, and that's obviously the ideal. Getting there, it's never certain how you would, but certainly we want to try to support as much as we can for states and agencies.
And another question for you, Jennifer. How has this study changed your thinking, if it has changed your thinking, about the role of housing assistance as part of the social safety net?
Yeah, it's a great question. And conveniently, ASPE in a couple of weeks will be releasing a study that's looking at a 50-year trend of poverty. And one element of that it looks at is housing assistance. I can sort of give you a preview of what the findings will say. Not necessarily groundbreaking, but it certainly supports what we have learned from this study. And that is that when you look at housing assistance and its impact on the poverty rate overall, housing assistance doesn't have a huge impact on the overall poverty rate, and that's simply because of the low number of families that are receiving housing assistance. But if you look at those families that are getting housing assistance, the effect is quite significant. It shows that, our analysis showed that the poverty rate would be almost double its current rate if that assistance was not available. And when we looked across all areas, not just including housing assistance, it's one of the largest poverty rate impacts among recipients of assistance. So it's certainly, something to think about. I think it supports what we've known, which is that housing assistance, in particular, as we found with this study, vouchers/subsidies just make a huge impact on the overall, not only housing stability of a family, but other effects as well.
So why is it important to raise children out of poverty? There
are lots of reasons. Obviously the last panel spent much of their time talking about that. I think at HHS, it's particularly within the administration of children and families. It's something that we think about every day. When you can get children out of family poverty, they have, longer term impacts. They're able to get better services. They're able to have, a lot of different things that are happening to them while they're a child that will have long-lasting impacts for them. So, it's a question that we always look at, not just in the context of child welfare, but certainly in our work on, the homelessness programs that we do for youth. Childcare, which the administration is working a lot on, is certainly something that we think about, correlation with child poverty, so it's on our mind.
We want to get children out of harm's way so they have a fair chance in this country, and we know a variety of things that happen when you're raised in material hardship may permanently change your opportunities. And so if we want to have equality at base in this country, we want to do something about the intergenerational transmission of poverty, and housing is a piece of it.
Kathy?
Just to state the obvious, we've got an incredible looming budget problem and fiscal crisis, and I think there's a lot of growing interest in Congress on finding strategies that both improve outcomes for individuals and families and youth, that ultimately will reduce the demand for public assistance and government services. And I think the more we can do rigorous research that figures out what are those interventions that do both, and ultimately save us money, we're going to be on far better track and have also a very bipartisan agenda.
So Kathy Stack, there were a fair amount of discussion about the kind of thing that you're trying to do at the Arnold Foundation, which is to increase the use of administrative data for randomized controlled trials, because it's much less expensive and then basing outcome measurement on surveys. And there was also some discussion both by Aletha and Ron about school records and how important it may be to start measuring outcomes on the basis of school performance, how kids are doing in school, how much they're attending school, and so forth. But my understanding is that this is very tough. Can you talk a little bit more about the progress that may be being made in getting access to the records of local school districts?
Sure. So, and I'll talk first about education, but some other areas, because I think there's lessons from other areas. So Ron painted a gloom and doom situation with upcoming legislation on FERPA, potentially upcoming legislation, and I think there's no question that the legislation is problematic. But there is also a tremendous amount of myth in the system now, where people assume that you cannot get access to data, when in fact there are exceptions that allow for researchers to get access to data, for entities to be designated as agents of school systems so that they can do useful research, and also lots of ways in which data can be pushed into a school system. The analysis can happen on the side of the government agency and then pushed out with very important findings. So I think there are and this is actually an area that a number of foundations are now talking together about, recognizing that creating the infrastructure that allows for administrative data to flow more easily to answer important questions is in everyone's interest, not just for researchers, but just service coordination and improving how programs work. Just a couple of thoughts on some of the building blocks that are now in place that I think we can do this better. There's a number of states and local jurisdictions. I'll give a shout out to the Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy Network that Dennis Culhane is running out of University of Pennsylvania. And these jurisdictions are ones where they have figured out how to identify important questions and then get researchers working with government to link the data sets, standardizing the MOUs and data sharing agreements, and now they are working on low-cost technology solutions that would make this much more cost-effective for other jurisdictions around the country to adopt the same model. I think we have seen places, and the Arnold Foundation is doing some of this, where rather than being a researcher trying to get data out of a government agency, if you can get foundation support or your university to embed a researcher in a government agency, then the analysis can happen. The Raj Chetty research is a perfect example of that, where the Arnold Foundation supported Raj Chetty to work with IRS, having access to all of that data and the powerful results that you can get. I also think we have an opportunity to think a little bit creatively about creating some intermediary organizations that could help bring data in to government agencies in standardized formats in clean ways that demonstrate that the privacy requirements have all been met. There are a number of agencies that are willing to get into the business of opening up their data and linking it, but they can't possibly deal with every mom and pop and every independent researcher sort of coming to them independently. So thinking together about how we create data flows and an infrastructure that can get the right organizations working together to make this easier.
I want to ask a question of both Kathy O'Regan and Jennifer Canistra, and this has to do with strategies for delivering services to families experiencing homelessness or other highly vulnerable families. I mean, I think I want to take a bit of exception to Sandy Newman's characterization of the study sample as being, different from other very poor families. In fact, these are families with incomes below half of the poverty level, and among such families, we have a really hard time figuring out or predicting which such families will fall into homelessness. Basically, everything we know at this point is that families who become homeless are very poor families. We can't predict anything else about them. So, but in any case, so talking about vulnerable families as well as very poor families, how do the findings about transitional housing, which are essentially that, so far anyway, bundling the services together with the shelter doesn't seem to have been an effective way of getting some of these outcomes like reduced domestic violence and better parental mental health and so forth. So how do you think about the way in which you deliver services to fragile families? Maybe starting with Jennifer.
Yeah, well, and you pointed out, I think one of the most significant findings on this question, which is that the project-based intensive services transitional housing, we didn't see effects on things like adult well-being or family preservation, and neither did we on rapid rehousing that had a lighter touch of referrals. So it's certainly one of, I think, the key findings that we're thinking about. So HHS has commissioned some additional studies using the family option study data, and one of them in particular is looking at how homeless families access mainstream benefits. And I'll preview what the data is supporting, which is that the homeless families are connecting to mainstream programs at the same or greater rate than similar low-income but housed families. So if these homeless families are already sort of connecting at a similar rate to things like TANF and SNAP and other benefits, then sort of what else do we need to do, which is what your question is. Clearly we know that subsidies are ideal, but we also know that, they're not indefinite. And so what can we do for some of these other models to perhaps get better outcomes? I think one thing that we've been thinking about is, does it make more sense to do really intensive time-limited services for something like employment? So to really devote the funding that you have and the resources you have to a particular area, would that make a bigger difference in terms of service delivery? Certainly for different populations, we talked about domestic violence victims. There are different services that make sense for one population or another. And another thing that I'll point out is that 27% of the parents in this study at baseline were under age 25. And as we think about service delivery, I think we can't actually compare impacts across ages because the sample sizes were too small across ages. But I think conceptually you can wonder, well, for these head of households who are on the younger age, 25 or younger, what sort of services should we be providing because of where they are at a different point developmentally and where they are, just in terms of kind of their family unit. So those are some of the questions we're thinking about. I will also say that HHS is currently undergoing a randomized trial of the Runaway and Homeless Youth Transitional Living Program. So it is certainly a question that we're thinking about, how do the services make impacts, and hopefully we'll have evidence that helps answer that question in the coming months/years. I did mention the additional research that HHS has commissioned. One of the studies I just mentioned has to do with access to benefits, both HHS and others, such as SNAP, and two more of the briefs that will be coming out in coming months that I'll just highlight for you are young children's experiences of homelessness, in particular their access to an experience of early care and education. So that's something that we commissioned, as well as adolescents' experience of homelessness, including engaging in risky behavior, school mobility, and whether these adolescents are repeating a grade. So those are three of the research briefs that will be coming out. There will be also additional ones, but just wanted to highlight those three.
So one of the things that the study did that Steve Bell didn't mention is that we did do subgroup analysis, splitting the sample on the basis of psychosocial challenges, and we created an index of psychosocial challenges. We created another index of barriers to housing stability, like history of eviction or no income at baseline. And we found that in both of those cases, it made no difference. That is to say, families with higher barriers or with higher psychosocial challenges also didn't have any impacts as a result of being given priority access to transitional housing. So I think we're sort of scratching our heads about what that all tells us about services and about the bundling of services with housing. So Kathy O'Regan.
So I'd like to I want to go inside services. We're using a category that actually has a variety of different pieces in it. And so for the project-based transitional housing, the idea behind the services was a theory that you needed those services for homeless families to achieve housing stability. And I think one of the key findings here with the permanent subsidy was, oh, that actually isn't true. So then I think you want to ask the next question, which is, well, so what services are needed by whom? When does it work? So I would disagree with you, Jeff, on my expectation that handing a homeless family who faces many barriers in various domains, including the labor market, that the voucher itself would just lead to improved employment. In fact, I don't think of that as for much of the housing we give. I think many of our households would need some form of services, so then what? Having provided them with stable housing, can they access mainstream services that bundle is enough going forward? You would think there'd be a group in that category. And then you may say, well, are there specialized subpopulations? So you were assessing one particular group in this study. I think it's Jobs Plus and FSS in that category. So for those for households who face employment barriers who are receiving subsidies from us, there are a subset for whom we can actually figure out the right mix. The Jobs Plus saturation model, so I wouldn't unbundle that model. I think the entire idea behind it is that the entire area kind of receives this, and that it's the peer-to-peer coaching, et cetera, that comes in. So that's what we're testing again, because it may be, for public housing residents in particular, this is a very good service delivery model, and it's different than what you get mainstream going to DOL or one of the other places. So I think we're still figuring out that service component, but it doesn't necessarily need to be in transitional housing as a way to get people stably housed when they're homeless families.
So Jennifer, do you have a perspective on how to link rent subsidies, including temporary as well as longer-term rent subsidies, to employment services?
You know, I think it's something certainly that is helpful to do. You know, I don't necessarily have anything in particular I could suggest. I don't know, Kathy.
Yeah, no, I mean, FSS is supposed to be, I mean, the goal with that is to be linking it while somebody is in our housing. Jeff alluded to the fact that there may be, he started with wraparound and then said, well, not so wraparound. Maybe pretty light touch in some places, and has a lot of variety. So I think right now the objective in the study is to be learning a lot more about what does or doesn't work there. And a piece of it that everybody wants to know about is the incentive, the rent incentive, and whether or not modifications that you do tied to employment services jointly enable, over the long run, this is actually not one of those short little interventions, over a period of years can actually lead to self-sufficiency.
And I will say Secretary Perez is currently chair of the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, and in his leadership role, you know, it's a question that he has sort of asked the administration and USICH to think about. He has spearheaded a couple of different initiatives and tried to make different connections. So I think we recognize it's incredibly important that for these types of families, getting them employment, in addition to once you have the housing, or even if you don't have the housing, how, you know, stable employment can make a difference. And I think, you know, one thing that we've also been thinking about is it's not just, you know, it's not always just any employment. So you want to make sure that it's something that, you know, they're able to maintain and flourish in and grow. So whether that's specialized training, so that they're able to have higher paying jobs as opposed to minimum wage jobs. I think there's a lot of different angles that we can, you know, think about and look at on that question.
So Kathy O'Regan, as HUD policymakers digest the findings about rapid rehousing, which are essentially that it didn't keep these families from returning to homelessness, didn't actually make them more likely to work, although it appears that they probably were working longer hours because there was this increase in earnings. How are you thinking about the design of rapid rehousing as it is funded by HUD?
I like that you asked, how are you thinking about the design of it? Right? Yes, because that's really the question that's on the table. So what we know from it is that it did not have the stabilizing effect on housing relative to usual care. Increased earnings and increased food security, so it had that component as a positive, but it's lower cost than usual care. So in a world in which we do not have subsidies for all the homeless families, it is an important part of the homeless shelter, of the homeless service system, right? So it is lower cost and has about the same effect on housing stability, so we can serve more families if we use it. But we need now to be going inside the design of these services, the rapid rehousing, and looking more at it. So we started in this when rapid rehousing was fairly new. It's evolved, it's on a steep learning curve. The next step is to take a look at the types of services that are associated with it and learn more about the outcomes for rapid rehousing to think about the next generation of rapid rehousing.
We did a small number of qualitative interviews early on in which we asked people We asked families how they were going about getting themselves out of shelter and what difference it made that they had priority access to one of these interventions. And what we found is the families were very anxious about rapid rehousing, and one of the things that made them anxious is that it was unpredictable. You know, what they had understood is that they had to keep coming back and to have a case manager question them about what progress they were making, and that whether they continued to get that rental assistance depended on their answers to those questions. So the design not only has to do with what kind of services the program is connected to, but also with the predictability of the rental assistance. Do you have any reaction to that?
Yes, I can. Jeff, you were talking about how do we search for homes. I'm thinking, oh, I have to come back in and do this interview again, and if I give the wrong question, I lose my subsidy. No surprise, psychological distress did not go down, and so yeah, I had a visceral reaction to it as you were describing the experience. So that's one of the places where on this type of a study, being able to do the qualitative interviews, even if they're limited, to gain insight of getting inside the box to what you might want to be doing for thinking about redesign is critical. And that was one of the questions you had actually asked us before. As the random design is critical for the rigor, but we need to take advantage of those type of interviews, qualitative assessment, to go inside some of the analysis for thinking about where it is that you might make changes.
Kathy, I know the last panel talked about this a little bit, but just wanted to give you sort of the opportunity to talk about the finding that having the subsidy decreased work rates.
Yes, the elephant in the room, or not so much a silent elephant. So as was mentioned, this wasn't a big surprise. It has been found in previous studies. The fact that we don't know yet whether it's temporary, right? So it has had fade-out effect in other types of studies and in the welfare to work vouchers. And so we really need to wait until the 36-month follow-up. But it could be, it's you giving somebody a subsidy. It has that income effect, but what people mainly focus on is whether or not the way HUD calculates rent payments is a key part to the disincentive. It's the 30% of income. So if your income goes up, so do your rent payments. So you're really only receiving 70% of your increased work effort. And so that's a really important question for us to answer. We have a rental demonstration going on right now that is looking at this. And what's interesting about that demonstration, to go back to the way that the previous panel talked about it, one way to get rid of the disincentive is, of course, you just keep giving more public subsidy. That's not very viable in the long run, not very appealing. The demonstration is taking a look at a change in the way that we calculate rent, where the removal of the disincentive comes also by having a decrease in the number of certifications. So that if your income goes up, it takes quite a while until your rent goes up, and it decreased costs on the public side. So there is the potential for this to be budget neutral and to decrease disincentive. And so that's what we're out in the field testing now. Should it turn out that the decrease in work effort here is long run, not temporary, there may be modifications that we really want to make across the board in the way that we calculate our rent payments.
Kathy Stack?
I want to ask Kathy O'Regan a question too. Sure. And that is thinking about the possibilities of access to administrative data. I've always found that the way you can get access is you identify really, really important questions that could be answered with administrative data, and then you can create the political will to make it happen. So what are some questions that you would like to see either in the existing follow-up study that could be answered with administrative data, or other questions or longer-term questions that would be great to know?
Okay, so I'm just going to add to your question what I was so intrigued by the way that you framed your intro, which is, and then you take advantage of that political window to create the infrastructure so that you can keep doing it and not wait until the stars align and you identify the perfect question where people are willing to, oh, we'll let you do something, right? You think you can't, oh, there are privacy laws, we can't do it. Oh, but I really want to answer that question. It turns out I talked to my lawyers and I can. Okay, now we put the infrastructure in. Now we have the data agreements. We need the infrastructure. We've got huge will for using our administrative data, and we're being overwhelmed by the mom and pops, as you said, the individual data licenses. That's not going to be a way in which we can go fully forward. We need the infrastructure. So I think from here, the last panel already identified the most important thing, right? The effects on the non-housing outcomes and what it means for kids will have bipartisan support. That's where we should be setting up the shared agreements and doing the data connection on this. When we show the power of that and you push to have the infrastructure, then we'll be able to do this. We should be doing this for every study we do that possibly affects kids, right? That would be where I would go.
Questions from the audience?
Hi, I'm Linda Bronston. I'm an environmental officer in public housing at HUD. On the services, the question that I have deals with substance abuse, because that's sort of the hardest to predict, and possibly also mental health. Those are very high-cost services. Yeah. Do we know one way or the other? Did they come to a better outcome with the housing options?
I know from the subsidy option that the self-reported use of alcohol and drugs decreased significantly. So that was one of the ones that I know about. Without services, this was just with the subsidy.
And not in transitional housing, and transitional housing typically does come with substance abuse services. That's one of the things that they're almost certain to provide in transitional housing. Another question? Yes,
Catherine Greenspan, formerly of HUD. I was curious about the whether you look very carefully at the job markets and particularly affordable housing in the communities that were involved in this study. I had some experience with transitional housing a few years ago, and the truth is many of the families were stabilized, but at the end of the period where they could stay in transitional housing, there was no affordable housing option in their community. Their children couldn't stay in the same school, for example, and there were no vouchers available because the housing authorities had closed waiting lists and there was no voucher that connected to the end of transitional housing.
Well, I think what we did find is that those who got priority access to subsidy were able to use those subsidies across all of these 12 communities. We didn't have any community in which we had a low rate of use of vouchers. Now you're talking about when somebody is trying to transition out of transitional housing and into without a voucher.
The family is still may have a huge rent burden and their supply of housing may be limited. But I was really talking about the families either in rapid rehousing or transitional housing who would need to find affordable housing in the community at the end of the time that they were receiving housing and services.
Danny Gubitz, by the way, is the director of analysis for the study. Let's explain who he is.
The unannounced panelist from the day.
Right, exactly.
So you asked about job markets and affordable housing in the 12 communities. So we haven't looked specifically at those. We only have 12 communities, so we haven't even tried to. 12 degrees of freedom, not that much.
We do have some pretty tight rental markets. We have Boston, we have Alameda County, California.
Hi there, I'm with CSH and I'm Nancy Mercer. And first of all, I want to applaud everybody because I think what this study has done is told us that housing is a three-legged stool, right? Employment, a home, and healthcare. And I just caution everybody to remember what Aletha said, that when we look at the services, it's the respect and the way we approach services. So we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Transitional housing may not have been the best, and rapid rehousing. Anytime you put rapid in something, I say, whoa, slow down, because I get scared, because it takes a lot to get to the places where many of these families have gotten to, and it takes a lot to get out. So I just want to say great, and let's look at our services and see how we can do it in a way that's respectful of the people that we're working with, because they're pretty resilient. We're the ones who kind of put the barriers in front of them. So not a question, just kind of a statement. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, Debbie Walker from AFT. Great study by my colleagues. Wanted to just ask you, though, we haven't heard much about health and health insurance. Now, one of the great natural experiments you might have is the ACA started during this, and some of the states did not take up the extra Medicaid option, which would uncover these. In addition, health care for the homeless varies across the country incredibly. And my last comment is substance abuse treatment doesn't have, it begins, maybe they have detox, but real treatment for substance abuse and mental health is going to take much longer. So I just wondered to what extent you've done that or could do that more in some of your sub-analyses, because I think you have a lot, which is also another whole complexity and variation in all the context and the services.
Well, let me first ask you a question about substance abuse treatment, which is, what do you, Debbie, what do you make of the finding that self-reported substance abuse was affected by a housing subsidy? Did that surprise you? Do you have trouble sort of thinking about why that would be so?
I would like to know more about which substances. For some substances, that might make sense because there was an easy way not to. It would depend on which ones. Actually, you probably don't have real
I think
opioid.
we asked both about alcohol and drug abuse separately. But let me respond to the other part of your question, which is about access to public health insurance. We are doing some little pieces of additional analysis of the data that Jennifer mentioned for HHS. And one of them was about, we did measure the access to public health care, and we found it to be very, very high, really remarkably high compared to data from the American Community Service about access to either Medicaid or state health insurance, and that's a little bit surprising. I think we found that in those states in our sample that were early adapters of broader coverage in Medicaid, the rates were even higher.
Exactly. In some of these states, they've been serving this population with Medicaid for a lot longer than others. So I would have to look at the 12 cities because that may be the secret. You didn't do it in certain cities or certain. I would just look at the states where you didn't do it, and did all of the are all these states in the northern tier?
No, if you remember the map, they're all over the place.
Yeah, but on the whole,
not very much in
on
the
the
South.
whole, I would just say within states, the substance abuse directors and mental health directors for a long time have taken this on as a big issue. I mean, not solved it, and then in addition, states themselves offer different services. So that would be another thing to figure in. Are states paying for additional services that are not the federal? Some states do that because this is a major problem. I don't know the answers. I'm just raising context is so important.
Right.
And I just want to chime in. I mean, I didn't talk about this as much because this is a panel on the family option study, but it's absolutely something that HHS, working with HUD across the whole administration, I mean, how does the Affordable Care Act impact homelessness? How does it impact, family homelessness in particular with increased Medicaid? Folks are able to get tax credits, permanent supportive housing. So it's a conversation we're definitely having. In fact, in the spring, Secretary Burwell keynoted the Healthcare for the Homeless conference, and those are the topics that she talked about. So it's a huge conversation we're having. It's part of this conversation with the study, but much broader as well.
Toby Halliday with Stewards of Affordable Housing for the Future. I have just a quick fact question for Jill, or maybe the stealth panelist Danny, about income for folks that are receiving vouchers. The income effect being that they didn't seek or didn't report higher wages. To what extent are we confident that their wages are actually lower, or maybe they're just reporting lower wages for obvious reasons?
Now, their wages didn't, their income did not go down. The impact finding is that their rates of earning wages, their rates of employment went down from, that is to say, the usual care, 30% were working. For those receiving subsidy, 24% were working. Not really high percentages of labor force engagement in either case.
Right. So my question is, compared to the other groups, they're reporting lower income increases. To what extent are we sure that that is actually happening versus just what they're reporting?
I guess that's a big question about the accuracy of survey questions about employment and earnings, but I think people think that people are really quite forthcoming in telling you whether they're working or not, and in reporting what their amount of income.
Yeah, my question's just based on the obvious reason that people receiving vouchers would have to underreport income.
Oh, okay. But
right.
I mean, but this is not administrative data. This is survey
But it doesn't
data.
affect. But this is the survey for here. It's not how they actually get assessed for what they pay for their rent, which is verified. We do that.
And the same questions were asked of the entire sample, so that if there's a bias in reporting your earnings, then it would be the same for the usual care group that it would be for the subsidy group or the rapid rehousing group, for that matter. Dan.
Thanks. Dan Weinberg of Virginia Tech. I wanted to go to the issue of building the infrastructure for future work, and getting the administrative data in some sort of centralized place for a lot of people to use it. I know that OMB is interested in this. There was some work with Kathy Wallman's office, for example. But I think the basis is there to be expanded, but some legislation might need to be handled. The Census Bureau has established this network, and now for about 20 years, of research data centers, making certain data available to researchers under certain conditions. They have the IRS data that Chetty was using. They have other things, unemployment insurance records for back to the late 90s. They have the HUD administrative records on housing receipt. And presumably they could get a lot more data if there was some either need at the Census Bureau or some additional legislation. This system of data centers is being renamed, rebranded as Federal Statistics Data Centers to bring more federal agencies involved, and presumably could bring in some of their administrative data sources. So there is potential here. The issues will revolve around what is permitted under current legislation to be done with those data. Not everybody can just willy-nilly walk in and say, I'd like access to the IRS tax records. You have to have a reason that will be convincing to IRS. Similarly, to work even using the census survey records or the decennial census, which you can think of as the equivalent of administrative records, you need to persuade the Census Bureau it will benefit the Census Bureau because that's in their legislation. So there may be some opportunity there to create some synergy across at least federal agencies to expand the value of those federal statistics data centers. And once that's proven, perhaps some states would start participating.
Let me just say something I should have said in answer to the last question, which is that for the next round of analysis, we are going to be able to use unemployment insurance records as a way of measuring whether people are working. So, and with the cooperation of HHS.
Can I just make a point? So if people aren't following it, Paul Ryan and Patty Murray have co-sponsored a Commission on Evidence-Based Policy, which the main focus is about how to enable data to be collected, aggregated, so that it can be used for research. And the approach they took, the bill has passed the House. It's pending in the Senate. There's some folks who are optimistic that it might actually get enacted this year, but it sets up an 18-member commission. And it does that knowing that they've got to create something that's bulletproof and high visibility for getting consensus, that it's okay to bring data together to enable researchers to get access to it. I think there's another piece of this that when they have the commission, they may also be able to explore ways that you can answer important questions without having all the data in one place by facilitating the process of setting up MOUs and data sharing agreements so that it's much more quick and standardized in terms of how you link data sets that may sit at the state and local level.
Well, I hate to have to end this panel, but I've been told to stop. So I want to thank our panelists very much.
I think in my closing, I'd just like to say that it was an amazing experience to be part of this discussion today with such a diverse group of thought leaders talking about input into the next study design for family options. What are some of the barriers to the gold standard of randomized controlled trials, and how do we break down some of those barriers? I know that our agencies that we're working with, CMS and HUD and others, as well as the Arnold Foundation, are working very hard to make sure that we can bring that evidence-based, rigorous research approach to more studies and collect a body of evidence that will move us in the right direction for policy. So thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. It's a tough cross-cutting problem. As we said, we've called it a three-legged stool, a six-legged stool. I think there's a lot of elements to figuring out whether housing stability and family well-being can be helped with important interventions. So thanks for your thoughts. Thank you for being part of our Bold Thinker series here at Abt Associates. Thanks for taking the time.